Welcome to Raging Bullets, a DC Comics fan podcast, episode 600. Welcome to Raging Bullets. I'm Sean Whalen, drnorge, and I am joined as always by Jim, the sensei of the whatnot, the Duke of the Sultan of Strategery, the indestructible, bridge-defying, appreciates when you knock Wonder Woman out so he is less confused. So says the elder statesman of the podcast, Segulin.
How's it going, eh?
On this episode, we are going to be doing a first of a two-part, which we didn't intend on doing, but it wound up being a lot more epic than we even realized. Look at Crisis on Multiple Earths Volume 5. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Justice League of America 159 and 160, and 171 and 172, which are two epic JSA JLA crossovers that we're going to be discussing. Our next episode, we're going to talk about issues 183, 184, and 185. A big epic crossover story featuring the New Gods. Longtime friend of the show, Eli, has created a new closing song for us, so please listen at the end of the show. Eli, as you know, is part of the really cool full cast audio drama podcast, Life with Althaar. So if you haven't checked that out, please check that out as well. But thank you, Eli, for once again providing us with such an entertaining closing song. Jim, we are sponsored, of course, by DCB Service and InStockTrades.com. What's going on over at DCBService.com?
We have the Other History of the DC Universe hardcover, 50% off, only $14.99. Plus, we got a really cool DC Batman Hero Collector Dark Knight cowl. It's based off of the movie, and it's 25% off, only $33.71. Thank you, DCBS.
Over at InStockTrades.com, they're running a big DC Comics sale right now. You can save up to 42% off on DC Comics. And when you click on there, there's just a wide variety of content. So I urge you to go to InStockTrades.com right now and see all of the amazing deals on hardcovers and trade paperbacks you can get right from that service. So I want to thank both companies for continuing to support our show. Mr. Segulin, for 600 episodes, what kind of a podcast are we?
Raging Bullets, DC Spoiler Podcast. Raging Bullets is a spoiler podcast. We go in-depth into plotline, story twists, and whatnot of the comics we're discussing on today's show. So, if you haven't read the books, you may want to come back later so you can better enjoy the show.
I have all kinds of questions that I'm afraid to ask, so I'm going to go in and talk about some comics. Our main discussion this episode is going to be Crisis on Multiple Earths Volume 5, containing Justice League of America 159, 160, 171, 172, 183, 184, and 185 from 1978, 1979, and 1980, respectively. Justice League of America number 159, written by Jerry Conway, penciled by Dick Dillon, inker is Frank McLaughlin, letterer Ben Oda. Justice League of America number 160 and 171 had the exact same creative teams. 172, 183 also had the exact same creative teams. When we get to 184 and 185, there is George Perez has taken over as the penciler, and on both of those, actually. And otherwise, the creative team is the same except for letterer Gene D'Angelo, who has taken over on those issues, respectively. I really wanted to do this on the show, and I'm so glad when you and I were talking through this, you suggested doing the whole trade, because issues 183, 184, 185 from October, November, and December of 1980, it's a pretty pivotal story for me because it's the first time I can remember. I was about 9 years old in 1980. It's the first time I can remember being exposed to Darkseid and a lot of the New Gods characters through this crossover story. I was aware of the multiverse at this point. I was aware of the Justice League and the Justice Society, but the new one for me, I may have loosely been exposed to characters like Mr. Miracle and stuff like that through team-up books, but I don't remember before this having and I like knowing who Darkseid was, or if I did, it was a very rudimentary, like, kind of, I knew that he was a big bad in the DC universe. I never had read a story of this caliber. I also don't remember before this reading a story that I felt was so epic. Like, this was big. It was a big, big story. So I'm glad we're going to talk about this. But these crossovers were a really important part of my childhood growing up, because it was like the introduction of this idea that, like, characters like Batman, the reason why they existed so long ago, and that those stories actually happened, that Batman, that original Golden Age Batman, still exists, but he's on a separate Earth and has grown old. He's got, and actually had passed at a certain point, had a daughter, got married to Catwoman, like, had a life. Superman and Lois over there also got married. They had a life together. So these characters moved on. And then there were other Flashes, like Jay Garrick, who also had a family. And Alan Scott was the Green Lantern over there. This idea that these characters were ones that existed and could interact with our heroes through this idea of traveling to different dimensions, which, as a sci-fi geek as a kid, because at this time I was heavy into things like Doctor Who, I'm like, wow, this is wacky cool. Like, time travel and dimensions and different things like that, like, bleeds over into my comic books too, and you can tell all these cool stories. It gave you this sense of an epic scope and scale to the DC universe. I was a big Marvel fan at this time too. I was reading X-Men. So it was fun because DC had kind of its thing going on. Marvel had its thing going on. Marvel was a lot more grounded in like street level stuff, where it felt like, it's weird to say it felt a lot more realistic, but they were dealing with issues that were a lot more street level, where DC was exploring like some of these big concepts. And I liked the duality of both. Like, both universes were really valid to me and were offering something different. And I think these Justice League America stories are great examples of that. And I think I'm oversimplifying what I felt as far as the differences between the two. There just felt like there was a distinct difference in Marvel and DC, and that isn't a criticism of either. It was more of, I liked the variety of flavor. Now, these stories are all new to you, correct? I don't think you've read these before?
Yep, this is 100% new to me, all of these things. And it's funny because as this was going on, this was during my Marvel phase. So I'm reading Marvel, solely. I didn't start reading DC until college. That's when I started getting into reading DC Comics. So all of this stuff, it's all new to me, but I'm looking at it, and it was funny because I'm reading this and I'm seeing the art style, and I'm seeing all that, and you can see that late 70s, early 80s fashion and style and all that. I was like, man, that's kind of neat, And I'll be honest with you, I want to reach out now and start reading. Like, we did 159, 160. I want to read 161 to 170. And I want to read the gaps between these stories and fill in the full piece and the full puzzle, see what actually happened in the Justice League of America, during that. It was kind of neat for me.
Well, one of these stories is a flat-out cliffhanger for both teams. It doesn't end. I mean, and I don't know that it did. So I don't know that there was a story told. I don't know if maybe an all-star squadron or something. I don't know, like, what if there was a book that went and told the stories that we see a cliffhanger in one of these, which was interesting. So I'm with you. I actually, this has got me Jones to like read more of this, which is interesting. So one of the other pieces too, you're mentioning fashion and style and things like that. Dialogue clearly was more late 70s, early 80s than now. And it's funny reading that and kind of going, wow, okay, there's some different dialogue choices and presentation. Even the interaction between male and female characters is decidedly different in this, but you see the tones of change in these stories. I thought it was really interesting to really step back into a different era and see the kind of storytelling that was going on there and how it was really the groundwork of some of the shift that we see today was actually occurring in the late 70s, early 80s. They were starting to play around with this in comics. What did you think about the dialogue? Did you have any dialogue? I didn't have any dialogue troubles, but I definitely noticed the fact that we're dealing with dialogue from a different era.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you see that, and you see how the character interacting and whatnot. So it was neat seeing Batman in this era because, again, this is the identity crisis mind wipe thing. So this is pre-paranoid Batman. So this is the more, he was actually more open, more friendly with people, and seeing him and Huntress, the interaction between the two of them, and some of the inner dialogue that he had about just the realization of what that Batman was able to do and what he's not, and this, it was kind of a neat thing seeing. I don't want to say a kinder, more gentler Batman, but he wasn't the dark, brooding, I'm a loner Batman. When I'm reading this, I never heard the Batman voice once, because this character seems so more open and friendly. And granted, he's around other heroes, so he usually lets the guard down a little bit. But there was a lot of Batman stories we've read where he's doing the Batman voice to other heroes, and it's, I think, kind of neat to see that kind of the guard go down. And I really enjoyed this, these stories, and it was kind of a neat thing to to do the dive back into the past, and it's gotten me motivated to read more from this era.
To put what you're saying into context, too, Jim, take it back further. This is pre-Dark Knight Returns. This is pre-Killing Joke. This is pre-Death in the Family. All of that era of Batman also has not happened yet. So it's definitely a very different Batman. This is the Batman I grew up with. So it's really interesting to revisit this guy, where he's at. And I love it. I mean, I've always loved Batman. So the various variations as the characters evolved over time, I've always dug him. So it's interesting to see much more the detective, but the emotions also he's a lot more open with than we're used to from the inner dialogue, which was something that's interesting. I think we're seeing a little bit of this Batman coming back. Now.
Right.
And it's hard to say coming back. It may be that the current Batman is evolving into a more modern, like a today Batman versus going back to this one. But it's interesting to see how this character has evolved over time. A lot of them evolved over time, and I really enjoyed that about this story. Did you like these stories? I'm guessing from your reaction of, "Hey, I want to read more." That's a pretty good indicator as far as where it's at. But how did you feel about this afterwards? Is this something that did you dig this?
Oh, big time! Yeah. These were cool stories, and I've had I've had the issues with some of when we're reading some of the older materials that I'm like, this had none of that. I had no groan factor at all. I was like, man, this would stand up. They could take this story and pass it off as a current day story. Little modifications they would need to do, as I said, art styling and make the characters look more like they look modern. But they could really just take this script, redo it, redo art choices, and drop it off in the current universe. They could. And that's something I think that is kind of neat, that this story stands up. The contents of the story, everything that happens in the story stands up 100%. And when I'm talking about art redo, I'm not saying anything bad about it. I'm just saying this is drawn in a different art style. And if they were to pass this off as a current story, they would have to modify it to fit how the characters currently look. Is all I'm saying on art redos. But otherwise, it stands up as is. You read it; it's a good story. I enjoyed it, and as I said before, it's got me motivated to read from this era. To actually look up stuff and actually read some of this stuff. And so that right there tells you that's a solid story. If it gets you wanting to read more from that around that story, that says, okay, this is something that they did a good job with.
183, 184, and 185 are ones that I'm sure I read because I read them obsessively. I had my dad photocopy the covers at work so I could color them in and trace them and stuff like that. I had tracing paper where I was tracing the covers because I had these designs that I want to do this. I want to be a comic book artist. I want to, and I have no artistic talent, and I didn't honestly have the discipline or motivation. And this is a compliment and respect to all artists out there, to the fact that you're dedicated to putting a lot of time into the craft. I did get from the library art books and things like that and start learning some of the basic fundamentals to try, but I did not put, and it just shows I didn't really have the artistic drive or talent. I was just a fan, and I was trying to maybe get more into the world. There was a How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way that was put out, the book at that time. and I ended up getting that, and I was doing it. It was here's the thing. All that time I spent on those things, it was more as a hobbyist, but I found what it did. None of it was wasted. It made me love comics even more because I at least had a rudimentary understanding as far as what kind of effort went into creating these at a young age. So why have you been in love with comics for your whole life? Well, it's because you get, wow, putting these together is really, it's a big process behind the scenes, and they do this every 30 days. I mean, it's like, yeah. So it's a super, it was really foundationally, I was 9 years old when I read these, and I was reading comics before this. This is just one of those stories, when people ask, what is your first story that you remember? I go back to a Marvel team-up with Spider-Man and Iron Fist as being one of the earlier ones I remember, but there's a lot of books I remember reading. This is one of those pivotal stories at 9 years old that I can go, this one I read backwards and forwards and everywhere in between. I read over and over again. I beat it up. And then hadn't touched it since maybe the mid-'80s because, just was reading a lot of comics afterwards and didn't go back to that. So I haven't read this story up until getting ready for this recording since the mid-'80s. So it's been a long time. I will tell you this. You're talking about crafting a part of the story that you don't see in between panels. There are things that I thought happened in this story that didn't happen. And I'm going back, I'm like, but didn't Batman and Huntress and Mr. Miracle do this? And I'll tell you about it when I get to it. But there's cool things that they did that they didn't do in my mind. And I had my imagination had been so captured by that story that there are things that I thought happened off page that didn't actually happen, which is a testament to the creative team and what they were telling in that story, that I so vividly imagined that I thought certain things happened that didn't actually happen. And it's a small sequence, but I'll tell you what it is when we get there because it's a lot more in context. The other stories, if I did read them, it was we used to get boxes of comics from flea markets and stuff. I can't pretend I read every issue because, they were big boxes. But I would make my way through, and I'd page through certain books. I would read certain books. So Justice League stories and things like that, sometimes you'd read one issue of it. This 159 and 160, for example, I vaguely remember part of it. And I'm guessing what happened was I read, the first part, but never the second. It would have been when I was really young. So I vaguely remember it, but kind of cool stuff like that where you kind of go, oh, wow, now I can actually read that whole story and figure out what happened with the whole thing.
Say, hey, I know the whole story now.
Because we really are spoiled now. It's very easy for us. If you miss an issue, we have tons of options. You can go to comic shops, comic conventions, and get the physical issue. If you're looking for that, you can go online and get the physical issue. You can get the collected edition in most cases. You can get the digital version of it, instantaneously. So our ability now as readers to be able to get them, as collectors, there's still if I'm a collector and I want that physical in my collection, I want the original. There's that hunt that's still there, which is great because nothing beats that. And for anybody listening to this that is, that likes to read, likes to have the singles and have the floppies and just have them in their collection, that hunt, there's nothing like it. When you finally find that good copy, because that's sometimes a trick too. If you're looking for a certain grade of that book, because you're like, I want it, but I want a really good grade for it for my collection. That hunt, there's nothing quite like it when you actually are able to track down that piece. And I imagine now it's even harder because these books are getting older and older, and finding those copies that are pristine is a lot harder to do. But it's a cool part about the nice part about comics right now is there's just a huge avenue to be able to get these stories, and I'm glad that we're having a chance to talk about this. Let's jump into 159 because truthfully, when we were talking about doing this, I was expecting JSA JLA stories. I didn't realize how many guests we were really going to get in this episode that we're able to talk about. I mean, dude, this book opens up. We've got Jonah Hex. We've got the Viking Prince, Miss Liberty, the Black Pirate, Enemy Ace. I mean, these are characters that I'm like, wait a minute. Some of these characters, I remember, but don't. It's which means they were in some form of crossover, something that I'd seen, or maybe I read this issue. Because as I turned the page and I was looking at them at the banquet, I'm like, oh, I remember this kind of stuff. Now, I don't know if I remember it from this story or not, though. So that's because we're getting really young for me now as with these particular tales. But I used to eat this stuff up when it was the crossover between these characters. I mean, look at that smorgasbord of heroes that are in there. Yeah. That is quite the awesome collection of characters. And this was my way, like these type of stories, DC Comics Presents and Brave and the Bold, and on the Marvel side, like things like Marvel Team Up. That was the way I started getting used to the larger universe of characters that both of these companies had at the time, was team-up books and crossovers. So this type of stuff, I was like, yes, more of this, please. I'd like to get to know that. I loved seeing this lineup of characters. Did you get that same vibe, like in this? Because obviously for you, a lot of these characters, you're seeing them in this context for the first time. How did that feel now?
Oh, actually, it was actually kind of cool. Yeah, you sit there, and I digged the how just that they're laying out, just the talking, and just the general the casual conversations that were going on in there, and it's what I wanted. You would want to see when these two groups had to get together and they have this little social gathering. And, the nice editor notes, I knew what was going on anyways, but it has the nice editor notes saying, hey, this is the annual meeting of these two and this and that. I'm like, all right, it lays out, within a couple pages exactly what you need to know. But then, you start going into it and they start showing, dealing with like, this is where Batman has all that inner mindset where he's talking, the inner dialogue where he's talking about Huntress. And I thought that, for me, was just a great moment in this issue where Batman's talking about, do I envy that his predecessor retired or that he had a child? And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool that Batman is kind of going through those kind of thoughts. And even the penny for your thoughts, uncle, and her referencing him as Uncle Bruce, because she can't call him dad because he's not technically the dad, but he's not a stranger either. I thought those were kind of neat little variances that they did in this story. And they continued it on through throughout all the stories. Wherever she has a reference to him, she's always calling him Uncle Bruce. And those two always have a special connection with each other told throughout these stories. I thought that was a kind of a neat thing to, jump right from the beginning where we start getting into this stuff.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting story because my Huntress was always Batman's daughter because of stories like this. So I knew Helena Wayne as being Bruce's daughter, not Helena Bertinelli being Huntress. And then obviously years later they did revamp Huntress, and they made a Huntress for Earth 1, and she was super cool too. I've always loved Huntress. Huntress as a character has always been way cool, but it always started off for me as Batman's daughter. I didn't remember these kind of dialogue moments until I was going through this, and I'm like, wow, this is stuff that as a kid I was being exposed to. And I thought it was really cool, the humanity of these characters that they were doing, because it's funny, I was talking about how grounded maybe in the stories Marvel was, but I think we forget when we talk about DC's older stories that they were doing really human moments like this in their stories. Jerry Conway, we haven't really talked a lot about Jerry Conway on the show. He's a writer whose name I don't always hear being mentioned, but he had a major impact. I mean, he told a ton of great stories, and these crossovers are no exception. And I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to. This whole trade is Jerry Conway writing. Hit it out of the park. I mean, these stories. There's some dated dialogue, yes, but that's not a negative. That's not a negative on the actual writing itself. It was written for the era. I think the compliment to this writing is the fact that all these years later, in 2021, this holds up. It's a really good collection of stories that I am really glad that I read. I think my biggest worry with this was I was going to read this and kind of go, boy, I remembered that as a kid and I loved it. I just don't have the same feelings. I walked out of this not only loving it as much as I did as a kid, but in many ways seeing it from today's lens, and maybe understanding more of what I was reading, really appreciating the human moments in all of this. This story, this collection all the way through, we're talking about 3 years worth of stories that really had some very human moments. Even Superman and Dr. Midnight sitting down, I loved the idea that these guys don't just have adventures together, they're actually friends. Superman and Dr. Midnight are sitting out as friends talking about how, hey, Soups is like, I was kind of unsure about this whole thing, but you know what? This was really a good idea. And I'm sitting here like, this is the kind of dialogue that I'd have today with my friends. I mean, this is it. How real they were being written at this time was something that is edgy. Even the Ollie and Hawkman dynamic, which I'm a huge Hawkman fan, obviously, as we well know. I'm just as much an Oliver Queen fan. I remember the rivalry between the two. I didn't remember them coming back buddies like this. I loved these sequences where the two of them in the satellite are like sitting here singing together, and Dinah's just sitting in the background, shaking her head, groaning. Which I'm like, my wife would be doing this when I was out with my friends. So these moments were something that were really, really important. And it reminded me why, as a young kid, reading these comics, they were so important to me. Because I grew up as a nerdy kid. I had friends, but like it was this situation where like I had a friend who like would be friends with me when we were like hanging out one-on-one. But then we were at school, you get picked on because you're a nerdy kid. And like they're not really your friend at school, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, and stuff we never really talked about on the show, but where comics were great is you saw these characters who, in some cases, didn't like certain things about themselves, right? And yet they were being encouraged by their friends in this to, like, find the good qualities. I think you probably did know this. I didn't much like myself until, like, later in life. Maybe, I would say, late 30s, early 40s, before I really started liking me for me. The whole Norge thing comes from the fact that, like, I was trying to find an identity for myself that, like, I really liked. And now it's kind of like I like me for me, and I really do. I genuinely say that. But a lot of what got me through that was stories like this, comics like this, where you started seeing, and I'm not alone in that. I think we've all been through that in life, where there were times where we're uncertain about ourselves and stuff like that. But as I was reading these stories, I'm like, I didn't realize growing up how pivotal comics really were to helping me try to find some balance. And I think we all have stories like that about how pop culture and these characters and being taken to these lands and getting to know the interpersonal dynamics. Because I thought the Sylvester Pemberton, Sylvester Pemberton III, I always stumble over his name, and Ralph Dibny sequences were some of my favorites in this. Because you had two characters who, they're on the Justice League and Justice Society, but they're really uncertain about themselves. And I thought it was great that these stories showed a continuity of their growth throughout them, because they pop up more than once. And it was something that I really enjoyed about what was going on in these comics at the time, because I didn't realize how much of a positive impact these stories were having on me as a kid. I don't know. It was a cool thing about this.
Oh God, yeah. It's one of the things that throughout the stories, throughout all the stories, they have a lot of the common theme going on is heroes never quit.
Yeah.
And I loved, just how much that came out in these stories being told throughout, and especially in this first one, but throughout all of them, they always had that the good guys don't stop. The good guys keep going. Heroes don't quit. You get knocked down, you pick yourself up, and you keep going. And the Ralph and Sylvester story was just that couple panels was a really neat to get that human side of it. And I especially love how how he's like, hey, you wouldn't want to have people calling for your name of Sylvester, Pemberton III. And he's like, well, I don't know. A guy named Stallone did all right with Sylvester. And I'm like going, yeah. And this was 78, so this was like the prime Sly Stallone stuff. This is when he's first really exploding on the scene. So I'm like, hey, that for me was a kind of like, oh yeah, that's neat that they threw that in there,
Doesn't he at one point tell him to, and if you want, you could even short your name to something like Les Burton.
Yeah.
Which was kind of cool. I enjoyed the dialogue in this a lot, because I felt like the early few pages of this were really setting up this friendly dynamic. Like, these people really do get together every year, kind of gather as comrades, and they wind up going on some, like, this wasn't a planned adventure that they have. Like, an explosion happens partway through their gathering, and there's meatballs flying like all over the place. Because
no, they're wasting food.
Yes, Yeah, but I mean, it was hysterical. That's because Jay and Barry, I think those are meatballs that they're sitting there getting from like the hors d'oeuvres or something like that, as they're talking about their marriages and what that looks like. And the explosion goes off. We go to, and this is something that I just geeky loved. We jump to this interlude in 3786 AD where we've got this villain, a time-traveling villain who the Justice League has a history with, who's, in this one you kind of go, is what he was doing villainous? Well, I don't know. He was experimenting with stopping time, right? And probably going to do it for some nefarious purpose, but he really wasn't, just to show like where villains were a little gentler at that time, he wasn't doing it with the intention of stopping time permanently. He was probably going to do it so that way he could use that invention to like go in, rob a bank, leave, and, yada, yada, yada. Well, he did too good of a job because he's crafted a computer that will stop time but cannot start it again. And this computer, this is like Brother Eye before Brother Eye, right? Yeah. Brother Eye existed at this time, but not, I don't know, to the same extent as what we saw in later years with Batman, where like he was, going to destroy everything. But the concept behind this was interesting, where this computer has been crafted so well. This was during the era, and I guess Brother Eye was around during this time. I'm being incorrect, because Kirby had done a lot with Brother Eye and that whole concept. So I got to correct what I'm saying here, because I'm being inaccurate. This was during the era where people were very afraid of technology taking over. Yeah. So you were now telling these sci-fi stories where we're basically saying, well, this machine's got a sentience now. He crafted it so well that he can't stop it. He has to craft this plan to defeat the Justice League so they become stronger so that they can come through time and to take this thing down. And yet it makes sense what he's doing. He's like, you either are crushed by defeat or you become stronger from it. And I love this whole concept of this story. It's such a cool story.
That which does not kill you only serves to make you stronger. And I love that notion. And this villain, and I'm doing air quotes around it, but he is really a villain. Because he flat out says he planned on stopping time so he could plunder all of the ages of man. Wealth, beauty, power, all would be mine if I could control time. But I couldn't restart it. So his plan was nefarious, but he wasn't, on the level of I want to destroy all of reality. So he kind of messed up in his own dealing, so he's trying to fix it, and he comes up with a way to fix it. So it was kind of a neat story in that we have a villain who's a villain, but he's not a villain on the level that he's going to be. And he's trying to prevent the ultimate destruction of all of time, because then it would destroy him as well. So it's like, it was a neat little kind of villain to have in there. And I'll tell you, I loved these art sequences. When you get that first initial shot of the interlude of the his fortress, that looks really cool. And then even going on to sitting there, he's sitting in the floating chair. He's got a steaming cup of coffee that's also floating in front of him. Little details like that to put into the story was something I really appreciated visually from this. So, just because of that kind of stuff.
To your point, and I want to shout it out because that's another name. Dick Dillon and Frank McLaughlin are not names that we've talked about on the show because we haven't done stories like this, I don't think, where we've done stories from this era. And if we have, I don't think we properly acknowledged the quality of the artwork because, so who takes over for Dick Dillon on the later issues of this? George Perez. Yeah. And honestly, as a testament to both, the high quality of artwork continued all the way through. I mean, this is from page to page all the way through. We're dealing with some really strong, high quality artwork throughout this story with, to your point, intense attention to detail. This is what I was growing up with as a kid. So to be pulled into this world and to be able to imagine things that are happening in between the pages was like commonplace when I would read comics. I mean, these were masters who were telling stories at this time. And it's really important to note this kind of stuff because the books that we're reading today, everything that we're finding as high quality comics, at some level, our current talent has been influenced either by these creators directly or by people who have been influenced by these creators. And you can tell because of just they were telling amazing detailed stories that weren't dumbed down. There was nothing dumbed down about this. The amount of dialogue we were getting here, the quality of the story. I mean, this is some heady stuff that we're dealing with. We're dealing with a big heady storyline. We're dealing with some character development and character drama on a real human level. People who are dismissing these as funny books, it's like you clearly didn't read any of these because what they were doing was really, really strong. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk through these stories because they're really important to me. Hey, now, what did you think about the chat? Oh, go ahead.
One of the things I was going to say is one of the things I loved was the dialogue with the reader. The editor notes, but they weren't actually editor notes. But it's like, mystified general reader, you needn't be. If you'll have patience, all will be fully explained in time. Throughout all these stories, they had these little notes to the reader, and I thought those were kind of neat. A neat, from this era, because we don't really see that nowadays unless it's intentional. The characters breaking the fourth wall. We don't see these kind of things, and I like that. This is something from this time period that they did, something that we saw in books we read when we were kids, and I was like, man, that's kind of neat.
So here's what this was really at the time, and it's where I think social media in its best uses. We see some creators that are really, we had Freddie on recently, and I think he's somebody who uses social media in a very strong manner, and there's a lot of great creators out there that are doing this where they're interacting with fans on a personal level and really appreciate the fact that they take the time to do that. As a kid, this was that interaction. So you would get these editor notes and they're talking to you. It starts to build loyalty to not just the heroes and the stories here, but the company, like one part of the club. Like they're talking to me, that type of thing. Stan Soapbox used to do this too over on the Marvel end, where and Jim Shooter used to do it too, where he would write letters and things. I think it was really an important outreach that they were doing in the comics. Sometimes it was subtle, like editor notes, like you're mentioning. Other times it was more formal letters at the end. Like sometimes the letters column would begin with a couple of paragraphs that were talking directly to the readers. Those type of things were really critical at the time because there was no social media, there was no video, there was no YouTube or conventions in the sense that we have them today. Now there's so many conventions going on that no matter what your budget is, you can go to either smaller local conventions, you can go to bigger conventions if you want to fly there. There's a lot of opportunity to have direct access. In this era, you didn't have that, not at the level that you have today. And this was the way to do it. And it was so cool. What did you think about the chapter breaks? Like, I liked the pacing of the story, and I didn't remember how often this was done in this era until we got into these stories and we're reading them. And I liked the pacing of the story, like that they were broken up into multiple chapters and in logical ways that it seemed from the story.
It helped with the guide you through the story. It helped, give you those little bits, understanding of who's who and whatnot. Like I knew who Jonah Hex was, but I vaguely had any idea of the Hammer, but the others I don't ever remember even reading or seeing anything about them. So it was one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of neat. That they do these little bits and they interlude to the future, further in the story, then back. And then this and that. And they were jumping around enough that it wasn't confusing, but it added to the whole stories to give us these final pieces of what what we need to know. So I don't know, I liked it. And it's funny because, I like the fact that they go with a World War I German pilot and not a World War II because you can't have a Nazi be your main character. So they went with the World War I ace and that. But I also liked how they pulled through the different eras and then explained how these people were able to take out the Justice League. It's enhanced powers. It's extra stuff given to them by the Time Lord. So it's kind of a neat thing to, see that, little bits, little detail on the story continuing and explaining it. And it was kind of nice.
Yeah, because these stories a lot of times, like you're mentioning, they did a good job of giving you the introduction of the characters without hitting you over the head with it, where it was like this long, drawn-out exposition about it. Because what you want to do is be familiar enough with the character that you can move along through the story and feel confident in who they are. But you also want to move along through the story. Because there's a big story here right now, and it's like, I'm all about JSA, JLA, but now I'm actually starting to get interested and care about these other characters that they're introducing through these stories, which is what happened for me every time. And still to this day, as we were going through, there were characters in this, and I'm like, okay, I kind of remember that character. And I do, but like, very much like, okay, I know that I think I read them in other comics, or maybe it was, in fact, one part of this that I don't, I don't fully remember. But I know these characters, and it was fun to get like the Cliff Notes version of this is who they are. This is everything you need to know to be a part of this and to understand how they're going to interact with others. Because that's really the key. This group has its own dynamic. It has to do with and the way that was clever in the story, because of the discombobulated nature of how they were taken out of time and plopped where they were, they're not fully alert. So I think it also helps that they're trying to figure themselves out and their interactions with each other, just like we are as readers, which I thought was a really clever storytelling tool. Because I felt like when they were having inner dialogue, or dialogue with each other, I should say, interpersonal dialogue, I felt like I could relate to them because I was in the same boat. I was literally in the same boat. No pun intended. But it was a clever way to tell the story. Jerry Conway was a very clever writer. I mean, this is... I'm marveling at this story because of how much I really enjoyed it. And I was deathly afraid with this that I wasn't going to dig it as much as I remembered myself digging these type of stories growing up. And I found myself maybe loving them more.
Dude, I'm 100% along with you. And especially I loved how they talk about how they can understand each other. That's always something that drives me nuts in movies and TV shows. And, it's like people who shouldn't speak English are speaking English and this, that. Right here, they explain it where, the way they explain it is, I don't know how we can do this. It must be whoever brought us here altered us or did something. And they even say, well, we got another mystery we have to figure out. And I loved how they spent 1-2 panels just saying, okay, yeah, we identify that this guy is speaking Russian, Germanish, whatever Van Hammer speaks. They're speaking the Viking dialect. They've got Old English. They've got Western. We've got all these different eras. They should understand each other, but they perfectly do. So that for me was something, again, really neat little attention to detail. And then even them acknowledging, hey, why did we attack these people? I love the fact, that they're recognizing something isn't right here. Our minds are being manipulated. We need to figure this out. And they even decide to take off and get out of there, gives themselves some distance, to try to put the pieces together. Dude, this right here is just really awesome storytelling into these characters.
Doctor Who used to do this through the TARDIS. It used to be the translation circuit inside the TARDIS. So and it was connected to the Doctor and the TARDIS. So as long as the Doctor was up and running and the TARDIS was up and running, you could understand people speaking different languages. But when either was down, that would affect that. So it's kind of a cool attention to detail in this, and you're right, I loved it in the story. I love that their confusion is, because some of these are people that we know to be heroes, because at this time I was very clear who Jonah Hex was. I'm like, well, yeah, he's rough around the edges, and he's a bounty hunter, and sometimes he's really a jerk, but he's also got a code and stuff like that. Yeah. So I love that this story, and he's interacted with these heroes sometimes in crossover books of their own. So it's interesting how these stories kind of address those people. And obviously Miss Liberty, you're going to sit there and like, well, she's attacking them. Why is she doing it? There's people who are clearly heroic in this. Superman like breaking out of the rubble and them kind of having to deal with the fact that their entire JLA and JSA, except for 8 people, was taken down. It explained a lot as far as why you wouldn't pick your heaviest hitters. Because they even took down one of the 2 Supermen. They explained why, well, yeah, in these crossovers, sure, there's the older Superman from the Golden Age, but he was taken out from this. And they were assuming it was because of age. This was done deliberately. Like, certain heroes were chosen deliberately to be up and running still. I don't get that. Because if I'm this guy, wouldn't you want the whole team coming?
Right.
It just shows that this villain, and I'm not critiquing the writing on this when I'm saying it, it shows the inherent flaw in this villain in general. This is the villain who, like, planned to stop time and never thought in the process to figure out whether or not he could start it up again. And set up a doomsday machine that can't be stopped.
The only thing I'm going to go along with him on why he didn't want all of them coming is because it's that whole motivation for the fallen comrade.
Yeah.
You know, you need to have that, you need to have that, win one for the Gipper attitude if you're going to step up your game even more. So now they've got their people down. Like, taking out Shaira, that's going to motivate, Carter to open up a can. So that's, kind of the deal. Taking out one of the Supermen, taking out one of the Wonder Woman, taking out one of the different heroes is going to motivate their counterpart to even be that much more. And I think that for me was a neat little story. But I also like how they later explained it wasn't just because of the impact. It was that chrono radiation that was keeping them out. Because, overall, in a story, you don't want a story of 20 characters. You want it narrowed down to these 8. So that way you focus on these characters. And It was a good usage for the storytelling. So in story, they limited it down again. So once again, it's not just, we chose this team to do this. No, there's a reason it's these people in the story. So.
And like you're saying, that's why I'm saying I'm not critiquing the writing when I'm saying that. It's more of and this is where when you get really into the story, you start believing that the villain's a real person, and you're like, you dope. Why wouldn't you just bring all of them?
Well, and I'll be honest, I asked myself that question, and that I think was one of the things with this story, with all these stories that we're going to be going. I was doing a lot of off-page thinking.
Yep,
I was thinking off-page, and I did think about why did he pick these people? Why not, have both Superman and both Wonder Woman on his team? And, it did really come to my mind where I was like, if he had both Supermen on that team, they'll be motivated to, because they're Supermen. But you only have one of the Supermen. That one Superman's going to be like, hey, I got to represent. I got to step up. Same thing with the Wonder Woman. If you have both Wonder Woman on there, and those two would be fighting, doing some cool tag team moves, because they're both the Amazonian warriors. But there is something about, with especially Wonder Woman, whether it's Earth 1 or Earth 2, that, defend her sister, continue on, I've got to represent. That there's an inner strength there. That's raising the bar up.
The Earth 2 Wonder Woman being used, I thought was a cool little touch as well. Because you're going back to the original Wonder Woman. And also, she's flying an invisible jet that's not hers, which they reference in this. There's that subtle sequence where she's in combat, and she's flying, clearly has skills at flight, but it's not her plane. It plays subtly into that fight. You talked about attention to detail. I loved little things like that. That this is the actual Earth 1 invisible jet, not the Earth 2 plane. And I liked the difference. I liked the little notations. And it was something in their relationships as they were interacting, they brought this stuff up. Dr. Midnight then having a closer relationship with her because of the fact that it's actually his Wonder Woman. So those type of things were, I thought, cool attention to detail that gave you this sense of a familial atmosphere between the teams because they've been through a lot together. And I really liked that stuff. Even Ralph's interaction with Helena, I thought was great because he kind of stuck his foot in it where you've got this, he was not trying to do what he did, but you could see how she would take it the way that she did. And she's got her own insecurities being a young hero. We've all been there, right? Where your parents have done these cool things and you're trying to live up to those standards. She's in that position where her dad's Batman. Her mom's Catwoman. I mean, the accomplishments, are pretty daunting. She's at this point, I've trained, I've got skills, I'm here for a reason, I've earned my spot. She's basically trying to tell him that. I don't think he was trying to do what he did, and I loved that awkward interaction between the two because it felt so human, right? Because we've all been there before.
Well, and also, you think, again, other off-page thinking I was having, what's going on through her head, because Batman's not there. So now she's worried about her Uncle Bruce. How's he doing? What's wrong with him? Because she sees him down, she immediately always thinks about her dad. So she's worried about him. So she's dealing with that. Plus also, in this story, she is the representative of the Bat. So she's the detective. She's the strategery person. So, she's got that pressure on her. So on top of the fact that her dad is actually Batman, in this mission, she's the Batman of the team. And I think that for me was kind of a little thing just where she's thinking, how she's thinking, how she's planning, what's going through her mind as well. So it's, I love that dialogue. I love that interaction between them. Again, it's that whole, they're completely not 100%, they're not 100% of a team yet. They're still getting their groove. They're still figuring out, because these are people who have been thrown together. A couple of them have a good, interactions and have a regular history, but they're not 100% yet. So it's kind of it's a neat little thing seeing the team grow.
Yeah. That's exactly a great way to put it. There's an opportunity to see the team grow. I liked seeing her without Batman, just because so often you see her either with Batman or with the Dick Grayson Robin as an adult interacting. And it's cool when you get these opportunities to see Helena Wayne step out of that shadow and really showcase her skills and her unique nature. I really enjoyed the team interactions. I liked how she was looking out for Flash, where she gets overtaken at one point in time fighting our resident He-Man. And she's basically telling Flash, listen, hey, this guy's stronger than we think. Like, watch out. And he gets taken out from it. And it was interesting how, as a team, they weren't fully prepared for the threat that they were dealing with. And that was something you get, like, these. So are these people enhanced in some way, like when they were brought up here? So they're not just coming here with their traditional skills. There's an enhancement for all of them that they don't quite understand, right?
Yeah, they're, one, physically enhanced, but two, all of their weapon systems have been enhanced. And you can see they did that with the artwork, where they gave it that little orange glow around all of the different weapons. So the weapons have been enhanced with that chrono energy, but they're physically also enhanced, because the Viking king prince there, he's much stronger than what he normally would be. And the swordsman is faster than he would be. So they physically enhanced them, but also, technologically enhanced them as well. So it was kind of a neat thing that they did that with, again, further explanation as to how these normal people can take out the Justice League.
I loved Elongated Man as a kid. And part of the reason why is he was a smart guy, but, like, he had an awkwardness to him. And I think there's something that made him infinitely accessible because of that. Because as I referenced earlier, I was a pretty awkward kid growing up. So you had this character who had that awkwardness, yet he belonged and he was part of the team and would show his worth in, like, amazing ways. It made it feel like you could be a part of the Justice League. It was kind of what Robin did with Batman, where you felt like there's this accessible character that makes you feel like you could be Batman's running buddy. Same thing with Elongated Man. Made you feel like you could be a part of a team. You could be a part of this group. Like, you could be not perfect and you could fit in. And it was it was a cool thing about the character. These books did a great job of having characters with a diverse range to them, as far as, not everybody was Superman level. There was, like, everything in between. That was pretty critical at the time. We're seeing that much more today, where we're branching out and getting a lot of newly created characters, or characters maybe that were characters that were second and third tier that have stayed back there, that are now being more prominently featured or reimagined for today. And I think that's a good thing, because this story is just showing me the importance of just having a range of characters, not even just with physical appearance, but with their confidence and their comfort level. And, it's okay to have that person that's a little more awkward on the team, yet they can still bring something to the table. This experimentation was something that, at the time, you didn't, if you were just reading Superman or just reading Batman, where you had these characters that were far more confident, these characters gave you a sense of, in the larger universe, there's actually people that aren't that meta, big time character. And I liked these characters a lot because they did make you feel like oh, I could be recruited to this team. Like I could be a part of this. It's in a neat way, without it being the person who was like, I'm not knocking Snapper Carr, but Snapper Carr was a human, right? Without having that person who was just a straight up human, like you could have different kind of power sets and be a part of it. The cool page off of that was that single page where you got to see the entire team defeated.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to call them villains. The heroes that are being controlled by villains, I guess, for lack or the team that's being controlled by the villain, for lack of a better term, laying over what is an impressive team of JSA and JLAers that they have taken down, even with enhancements. It was something that, like, the artwork is brilliant on it, because I grew up adoring these characters, and I still to this day. On my wall right now, I'm looking at that. It's that wraparound cover that was around the collected edition of Crisis on Infinite Earths, with both Supermen, one holding the Golden Age, holding the Earth 1 Wonder Woman, and Superman holding the Earth 2 Supergirl, kind of screaming. And it's got every character drawn that you can imagine on it. But the reason why I'm referencing that is it's one of the things I've always loved about DC is the multiverse and the sheer wealth of characters that they've got, with multiple versions of characters, whether they're the same character reimagined differently, or it is, I mean, when I say same character, I mean like multiple Barry Allens, for example, or Barry Allen and Jay Garrick as an example, Alan Scott and Hal Jordan as an example. Because we've got 2 Clark Kents on this poster, but you've got like different versions of the Flash that are on it as well. And it's something that I think DC is unique in the way that they've been able to make that work over the years. And I quite like the difference. I'm not a DC versus Marvel fan. I'm a DC and Marvel fan. And the reason why I say it that way is I like the distinct differences between both universes. I think there's something in the foundational growth of both universes that, like, when the writers get it right, they tap into that DNA. It's like there's times where I'm in the mood for a Marvel story, a big epic Marvel story. And Marvel can do an epic story like some of the ones contained in here, and they're going to just feel differently because it's a Marvel story, right? Because of the characters and the way that those characters come through. DC, it just feels different when you do it right with a DC story, and it should. It's a different flavor. And I like that about both universes. Yes, on the surface, they're both superhero universes. It's the reason why you've seen, though, things like the Valiant universe pop up, and Dark Horse's experience with their own comic universe. We've seen in Image, Kirkman's did things like Invincible, for example, which is got its own cool little universe going on. You can explore superheroes in different companies with different creative driving it, and you get a different type of storytelling, and it's something that I think you need to hold on to. I was never a DC versus Marvel guy. It just never was. I never wanted to see one win over the other. My thing growing up as a kid was, man, I wish I had the budget to read all this stuff.
Yeah.
Or now it's the time to read everything that I want to read. So it's an interesting sort of, and I don't think I'm alone there. I think there's a lot less DC versus Marvel people out there than one would think.
Yes.
I just think the people that are incredibly, adamant about it, I think are more vocal, and sometimes go out of their way to be more harmful than they are helpful. But I love all of this stuff.
I'll tell you, 100% agree with what you're saying. And it's funny, as you've been talking, I've been looking at that one page. Yeah. That it has all the heroes laid out and has the other true above them. And I'll tell you, I got to tell you, I absolutely love this artwork. This is classic comic book artwork for me. And it's absolutely beautiful. And the attention to detail on facial expressions on things, but also on the background. I love the fact that we got the invisible jet in the background, but the canopy is open, because it would have been open because they had to bail out of the canopy, so it's there. Even they've got the 2 horses, the boat, you can see the boat, the plane, everything in there, and it's just all this stuff in the background. You got the main look of the heroes laid out with the other people above, leering over them, but they didn't just stop there. They made sure they put the stuff in the background and all that. It's just, absolutely wonderful. This, is just this is a poster. We always comment on poster right here. This is a poster.
Yep. And honestly, one I want just as much as any current one. It's attention to detail is something that I've grown. I think what's fun now about reading some of the older comics is, I think there's this perception that like older comics were somehow dumbed down. They weren't. The story. Yes, there's some challenges as far as dialogue. So you have to prepare yourself and when I say challenges as far as dialogue, it's just a different era. So you're going to have, there's clearly some late 70s, early 80s dialogue in this. You and I are probably much more comfortable with that than maybe some of our younger listeners that are on here, just because of the fact they didn't necessarily grow up in that era. We did. But I would say that we have talked on the show about how you notice it more in like some Silver Age comic books and stuff like that. But in those stories, I think the same thing we can say right now with these are the depth of story. I mean, this is a dense read. I mean, we've been talking about this issue right now for almost an hour. It's because it's a very, very dense read with a lot going on in it. I love that. I mean, talk about bang for the buck. This was a 50-cent issue. And the page count of this, dude, these were 44-page issues at the time. Or the next one is, I'm sorry, I think a 44-page issue. That's like intense what they were doing back then. Now, I don't know if, when it says 44 pages, I don't know if the main story was 44 pages or if it was, because
I think the total book was, so it has it with all the advertisements.
I got it. Because I'm like sitting there, I'm like, this wasn't a 44-page story. I know that. Boy, that's a selling point. You get, not only do you get that, but you get these cool, although I loved the ads growing up. Like, I do wish some of the ads were in here because some of the ads were wacky back in the day.
Well, and I wish that, like, because these, there was the notes to the editor and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I also wish was in on this because, again, if you're going back in time, because we're both reading this digital, so if anybody wonders, that's why we don't have if we had the physical issues in front of us, we would see all those neat stuff, but we don't. And I'll tell you, that's something I do wish they would put in these things. Give us those advertisements. Give us those letters to the editor kind of stuff. I think, I would have, again, I don't know. I would dig it just as much, if not more, to have those extra little stuff in there.
It's a reason to seek out, I guess, the individual issues. And I would, here's the thing. I have so many things that I own physically and digitally. I think what I like about the digital now is I'm not pulling out the physical book and damaging it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like, it's almost like my physical is my collected, archived version, if that makes sense. And the digital is the one I can read through this and page through it, whip it back and forth, and I'm not damaging anything as I'm doing that. And I like the distinction between the two, being able to do that especially for these type of things. There's a convenience, I guess, to being able to do that. We're spoiled in a way that I think is really cool now, being able to see them. There's a crispness of seeing these stories too in the digital. I will say this. Older comics like this, when you see them on the paper, because the printing style was different back then. It wasn't. We got used to a higher quality of paper. The paper quality was different back then. The printing method was different back in the 80s when they were doing this. It's interesting to look at these books in the original print format versus this.
Yeah.
Because the artwork comes off a little differently on the paper because of the way that the ink is handled by the paper style, the printing style back then. So it is something that's well worth seeking out, issues like this in the original format and paging through them and taking a look at them, because it's different. And there's that smell that they have not invented an iPad yet that can replicate the smell.
Yeah, that old
and there's something
old comic smell. Yeah,
there is something to that comic smell that's there. These covers with the roll call on them were some of my favorite as a kid, and they still are today. I geek out at this because it starts you off at the get-go. If I pick up this book, I'm getting Superman, the Flash, Elongated Man, Hawkman. I'm getting Wonder Woman, Huntress, Star-Spangled Kid, and Dr. Midnight from the Justice Society. I mean, that stuff is way cool. And then in the center, you've got these other characters that are fighting dinosaur creatures or alligator creatures, whatever the heck you want to call them, and a giant plane in the background shooting at them. The importance of the artwork, the artistic approach to a comic book cover is fascinating, because you have to make that decision to say, this is it. This is the purpose of this, is whether you're at and at this point in time, your newsstands. On the newsstand shelf, this book is going to be there with a lot of other books. This is the way to pull people saying this is the one you want to pick up. And you see how that cover would be the one that would do it. You know?
Oh, big time.
Hey Kids Comics on the spinny rack, if they had spinny rack. I remember French's Pharmacy by us. You remember French's.
Yep.
French's Pharmacy and the 7-Eleven across the street had comics. And they didn't have they invariably did not have the same one. Sometimes if you would like go to the one and you're like, dude, where's the Justice League comic? I know it's got to be here. You had to go on a scavenger hunt. Like that, because there was no other way to get it. Sometimes if you were lucky enough, you could go across the street and it may be there. Other times, if you missed it, you missed it. That was pretty much it. Sometimes you'd catch it later in a 3-pack at a store. Sometimes, if you were lucky. So stories like this, either you would get part 2 and have no chance of reading part 1, or you'd get part 1 and be stuck with a cliffhanger. And you were done. So there's so many stories that I read as a kid where I read part 1 over and over and over again. You kind of imagine where you think it's going to go. Invariably not where it ultimately went. This story, when you turn the page, I know I did not read the second part of this because I would have remembered just the kick butt opening of this, where they're like beaten by 5 ordinary men and women plucked from the past and supercharged with a super energizing force. Now, the cool part about this is, in the first 2 pages, they do a really good job of, if you didn't read part 1, because they had to, we're going to bring you completely up to speed. I'm going to be honest, I read part 1. I loved these 2 pages. Because while I was reading this for this show, and I read it multiple times, I was reading other things. So to kind of get like brought back up to speed, like on our last episode, this is great as a storytelling tool. I'm completely cool with this. Bring me up to speed, then jump me right back into the story. It wasn't a lot of real estate. It was 1 page that was brought to not only bring you up to speed, but where are they at now? And they've determined now who the villain is through like clues, showing how smart Superman is. One of the things I loved in this era about Superman is, I think we're very used to Batman in this era being the strategist, right? And so every time there's somebody who's solving who the villain is, it usually is down to Batman, right? Growing up, Superman had all kinds of wacky experiments going on in the Fortress of Solitude. Like, he was an incredibly smart dude. And we're seeing that brought out here in this story, where Superman figures this out just because of past history. Superman is a very intelligent hero. He's got a lot of knowledge that was brought on from his time in the Fortress of Solitude, where he was studying and learning from Jor-El and learning from everything that was sent with him. We forget oftentimes how bright a guy Superman is, not only from his being raised by 2 really cool parents from Earth, but also the way he was. There was elements of Jor-El. Jor-El did raise him to a certain extent by his time when he went in solace in the Fortress of Solitude. So that's brought into stories like this, and I love that, because it's something we forget about Superman quite often. And when stories highlight it like this, tiny little detail, but yeah. I really appreciate it, because it's something that's cool about the character.
We see the reporter. We see the investigative reporter that he is, you know, and I've always digged those Superman stories where it's not just about punching somebody to solve the case. It's about the deduction. It's about the intelligence. Yeah, it's there's so many facets of Superman that are really cool. And again, this story did a great job giving us pieces of each of these characters. There was no one character that really outshined the other. And I think that is a great compliment to the usage of a team, you know, the team dynamic. This could have been all about Superman and Wonder Woman take down the big bad, but it wasn't. No. In the end, it wasn't. Both of them got taken out before the big final fight. And I thought that was a neat story element to go into this, how this is about the team. Yeah. This is about, you know, rising up. And this whole thing has been about heroes stepping up. heroes, not letting adversity defeat them, about pushing forward, about, it's gut check time. And I like seeing that. I like seeing my heroes go through that. And and again, it's something that the story really laid out about, never say die, never quit. And that was something that I think really stands up today. That's why I said this story could be retold as is.
Yep.
Boom, modern time. And they could very easily, they'd have to do, obviously, as I said, slight tweaks, to fit into what the current universe is, but the story itself would hold up. And I think that is a neat testament to the story from 1978.
This could be done as an animated feature right now. One of those DC animated where they just adapt this. And you're right; it's a very contemporary story, and it's actually very now on things that people are interested in. You're right, with some simple tweaks, just to modernize it a bit. It would be a great story now. And honestly, the villains themselves, or the villains' pawns, wouldn't have to be modified at all. It's really just more the heroic side that you'd have to make some slight adjustments to. Elongated Man was really interesting in this as being one of the spotlighted characters, because again, you're seeing this hero who is really uncertain of himself and his role. As readers, we see him as the most awkward member of the team, right? So how he underestimates himself. It was something Claremont was doing in the X-Men as well. I didn't recognize at the time how much Justice League was important to me because they were doing things like this too. It's why a balanced Justice League team really works, because you have those characters that are your ones that you look up to, like Superman and Batman, who are, they're less flawed, right? Because they kind of need to be. You need to look up to them in that capacity. But we can see ourselves a part of their team, and they're needed. They need these other characters to round their team off. You can't just have Superman and Wonder Woman. You can't just have Batman on that team. You've got to have some of these other characters. They have unique skills that they bring to the team that round the team off and make these things possible. And it was something that was really neat at a time when, like I said, as a kid, when I didn't like myself much, you see this character who kind of didn't like himself much, and he's like doing okay. And like then all of a sudden becomes the shining star, and you're like sitting here like, well, that's motivating, like, and like that's kind of cool. That it's neat. Storytelling does this, right? TV shows that you binge watch do this kind of thing, and this was, I think, it's one of the reasons why today I'm frustrated by the sales numbers of current comics, because you see all these shows that are high quality but are being binge watched by people. It's like, all of you're watching comics. I'm sorry. These seasons of these programs that you're watching are an arc on comics. That's what they are. You aren't recognizing that this storytelling style that you're all loving, which is terrific. I love it too. So I'm not knocking it. It's like, this is what comic books have always been. There's if you want more of this, you can take it with you on the go in comic book format and experience it in a different way. We binged watched seasons of Justice League when we did this for this recording, and I love that kind of stuff. I think it's really great, and I think it's why some of the television that we're getting nowadays. I started watching on Netflix the Masters of the Universe cartoon, the new one. Yeah. And I'm binge watching my way through that. And I gotta tell you, that's the way to watch an animated series. Like, I like watching multiple episodes, and it's really smart. And I haven't made my whole. I don't have a judgment on it yet because I haven't made my way through to the end, and I don't think you can until you make your way through the end. There's some pieces of it where you're like, "Whoa, that's what they're doing." I don't know how to feel about that, but isn't that true of any story like this? Yeah. I could see reading this as a kid and being left with the cliffhanger and having to wait, and then maybe never reading where the cliffhanger goes and going, I don't know if I'm comfortable with where they're doing. They just beat the Justice League. What are they doing? And I can see as a kid questioning that, like we do TV today, right? But this would be the kind of comic shop conversation that we'd have back in the day. And I love this kind of stuff. I mean, it's amazing. You're right. I think you're echoing it. And I think my biggest worry about doing this episode was, would this hold up or not? And you don't know until you actually read it. And I was probably just as fascinated with my own reading experience as I was yours. because you were really going in blind to all of this.
Yeah.
I knew there were 3 issues out of this that I was at least going to have nostalgia for, because I knew not only that I'd read them, but they were foundationally some pivotal issues for me. And I'm excited for us to get to that conversation when we do. These stories, we kind of both walked in pretty... if I read these, Jim, at all, it was so loosely, and I didn't read both parts of them. I can't remember this. The dinosaur fight, dude, when he starts bringing in a time-traveling dinosaur.
Yes.
And, like, that's not enough. I would be freaked out if Jonah Hex was coming for me. Now, forget the rest of the team, and I'm not knocking the rest of the team that he's with, but I got Jonah Hex now is mad at me. My plan was to send Jonah Hex and this team after the Justice League and Justice Society, then they're going to come after me. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to trust my computer to take them down. I don't know that I want Jonah Hex... Out of everybody in this batch, the last person I want at my doorstep mad at me is Jonah Hex.
Yes.
Because I'm pretty sure that's not going to go well for me if he manages to make it through. Now, I get it that they don't have the benefit of their magical versions of their equipment anymore, because you're right, the glow's all missing. And you can and you're going to trust that this computer sends like overwhelming numbers of these creatures from a different era. The other creatures that come up look like they're from Land of the Lost.
Yes. Well, and here's the neat thing: it was the bizarre the ape lizard breeding. The strange race that developed after dozens of atomic wars. And I'll tell you, I can't remember who said it, but I a long time ago read this one. Somebody said how our stories that we tell are the fears of society. So like the big story, like, when you look back at like Frankenstein, back when that story was told, the big fear of society was science, and, it just, any like major epic story, like all the zombie stuff. Why are the zombie stories so popular? Well, everybody's afraid of this pandemic. Everybody's afraid of viruses. Everyone's afraid of these diseases mutating and making people freaky and whatnot. So it's the societal fears are what gets put into stories. Well, right here within this one, we've got the fear of atomic war. Back in the 70s and 80s, this was all the beginning of the arms race, man. We had all those heavy fear of nuclear war and this and that, and, machines rising up and taking over, and, all that kind of stuff is played out in this story. And I love seeing that, because that's what one of the big fears that was going on back then was nuclear. This was the beginning of the looking at the nuclear war. This was the beginning of the machines taking over. This is all the beginning of all those different stories, that are a sign of the times. And I love seeing that in the book, because of that mutation of this weird, crazy race that's pure savage. I was like, oh man, this is awesome. Yeah.
And you're right, it is. It's very, very cool because of the fact that it's exploring on some topics that we like to think that these more advanced topics were things that were invented today, and they've been certainly evolved today. But this was stuff that was going on back in the 60s, and in science fiction. And being constantly then brought into comics in the 70s and 80s, really heady, smart stories that were going on. Chapter 2 of this, we get to see Aquaman come in for the first time. And I always liked Aquaman as a kid. I didn't understand him, though. And what I mean is he was always the one that, he was on monitor duty or things like that. I hadn't been reading Aquaman at this time, so I didn't totally understand just how much lore had been put into his backstory and what that looked like. I really feel like if I'd read Aquaman as a comic as a kid, I would have loved him at this time. Because when I read him in the Peter David run, Peter David was pulling from the lore that was in place and, obviously putting his own spin on it and things like that. But he was going to the roots of Aquaman and bringing a lot of that stuff and making it cool and trendy for that particular time. I recognized that during this era, when I saw Aquaman, I'm like, well, that's the guy that's on the monitor duty that talks to fish. And it was kind of, I don't say that in the sense that I disliked him. a lot of what I knew of Aquaman was from the Super Friends. I always enjoyed him on the Super Friends. But he wasn't like, was he your favorite superhero on the Super Friends? No. He was kind of like middle ground, where I enjoyed him. He was a cool character. I didn't want him off the team. I always liked him. He was one of the friends. But he wasn't like this top-tier guy that I like wanted to follow until I understood him. Now I'm an Aquaman sponge. Because he really is an amazingly cool character. But it's funny looking at this version of Aquaman and thinking to myself, what was I like with Aquaman in this era? And I liked him. I liked him being a part of the team. I loved when he made an appearance. But he was always this character who got kind of left out of the mission, right? Because, what would he be doing in this mission? And I didn't understand that it would have been perfectly appropriate to have Aquaman on this mission because he would have kicked some butt.
Yeah.
Him being there right now it's funny, I read this differently than I would have back then. Because he is like the veteran right now who's walking in. He happened to be off camera when all this was happening. And he's able to walk in and analyze the situation and help out. He's like, hey, we got some equipment on the satellite that we can help you with. Let me get that stuff down here. And we are going to try to undo this. I'm thrilled because I thought we just lost some of our heroes. And now I'm realizing they may not be dead. They may be solving this. This is great news. So I need to get these other people up and running so we can somehow maybe help them. And I think it's like really cool to see Aquaman in this role because he's analyzing the situation and taking action and really plays a good part in this story.
Yeah, I did chuckle with the control yourself, Aquaman.
Yes.
When he gets excited when he hears his friends aren't dead. I thought that was a neat little panel to throw in there. And then even, again, as you said, other stuff where, I'll tell you, if I'd read this back then, I would have just, really dismissed this for just, okay, whatever.
Yep.
But you look at it now and you understand, okay, this is kind of a neat, piece to play in it. But it's a great explanation how all the other characters got taken out.
Yep.
It's adding that whole chrono energy kind of thing, that's strange radiation, and I loved seeing that. I was like, oh, that is kind of cool, that we've got this further explanation why the other people are down and out. Why didn't, the other Superman just bounce back? Well, here's why. Why is Batman out? Well, here's why. And it was kind of neat, just a little extra, add on to the story.
Exactly. And I think you're nailing it. I do read this differently now than I would have as a kid. I would not have tapped into that the way that you are now. And it's totally how I read it this time. It's fun to read some of these stories now and approach it with a different, more mature sensibility and go, wow, what they were doing there with that storytelling. Even the Control Yourself Aquaman, they went out of their way to do that to show the level of emotion that he had realizing that his friends are alive.
Yeah.
And it was such a cool over-the-top way to do it, but that's what would happen, right? And you showed that in one panel. One panel, they showed that. I thought a ton of emotion comes out of one panel. And it was really cool how they did it. I always am amazed when they've got storylines where you've got heroes that are like Dr. Midnight and Huntress, that they don't have powers. They're being thrashed into these like seas of infinity and stuff. I was like Batman being put in these type of sequences because he's a fish out of water of sorts, but he adapts and improvise, adapt, and overcome and that type of thing. You see that with both Dr. Midnight and Huntress in this. I always loved Dr. Midnight as a kid because when we started introducing Justice Society into these crossover comics, I was fascinated because their costumes were so different than like Jay Garrick, very different than Barry Allen. So I became fascinated by him. Alan Scott, the same thing. Like, who are these characters? They're the counterpart of a character that I know. And Dr. Midnight was one where it's like, well, who's he supposed to be the counterpart of? And he's not really the counterpart of anybody in our universe. And he was like Dr. Fate's the same way, right? These are these characters where, okay, I got people that I can like pair up, and then I've got people that I can't. And it was, when they did these team-ups, it always made me fascinated to see the diversity of these characters that were, like Star Spangled Kid. He's not connected with anybody either. I loved seeing these colorful characters that don't really have a counterpart in Earth 1 proper. And it was even like Stargirl now, who obviously has some winks and nods to Star Spangled Kid. She's not the counterpart of him. Any more than Huntress is the counterpart of Batman, right? So it's it's fun to see these characters and see where they came from and see that these concepts are still relevant today. Like actually the characters that I rattled off like have appeared in current media and TV. Dr. Midnight, there's a new Dr. Midnight. Star Spangled Kid, there's a new version of that character who's in current media. These are Huntress has appeared recently on TVs and such. These are characters that have been modernized for today, and we do see these concepts. DC's got just a wealth of really cool characters that are able to, with some slight tweaks and changes, be very current and contemporary. And we're seeing these kind of stories, these kind of crossovers happen on television in ways that I love when they do this stuff on TV now. Was there anybody on this that stood out for you as being somebody that you weren't interested in previously that this made you interested in? Is there anybody like that stood out that you're like, oh, I'm glad that character was in this story because I really enjoyed their portrayal in this, or I wasn't aware of that character before now, but I really dug them?
Well, the only character I wasn't really aware of was Sly. Was the kid. Mm-hmm. He's the only one I don't think I ever even knew existed. I maybe saw an image of him, but to be honest, I have no idea any of that. His who he is or any of that stuff. So when he first started shooting from the cosmic, from his cosmic belt and all that stuff, I'm like, oh, okay. And I started trying to figure out, I'm like, oh, okay, so he's got, instead of the cosmic rod, he's got the cosmic belt. Okay, and that was kind of piecing things together with that. But everybody else was, I knew who these characters were, and it was neat seeing Ralph, I'll be honest with you, because remember, my introduction to Ralph is Identity Crisis. Mm-hmm. So I got to see the mature, older Ralph who was tormented by the death of the love of his life and just all the pain that he went through, everything that happened to him, and just telling the full telling of his story, from beginning to end. That was my introduction to Ralph. And then later on, with the 52 story with Ralph, that's Ralph. So seeing this version of him was really fascinating to me, just because, again, I had no idea this is where he started off to where I saw him as. So, because there's a dramatic difference. There is a dramatic difference between the Ralph that I know versus this Ralph. I know a more confident Ralph, I'm not Superman, but I'm a detective, Ralph. And that's the guy I know. So seeing this version of him where he's not as, I don't know what I'm doing here. He didn't have that confidence in him. And he's a little bit more of a goofster than the Ralph that I knew. And I thought that was kind of a neat thing to see this earlier, younger version of him, knowing that he grows into the more mature person. Because we read a past story that had Ralph and Plastic Man on a team. And Ralph was a little bit taken off by how Plastic Man was more goofy. It was the more mature, more responsible Ralph who's a detective, not just a guy who could be stretchy. Where he's looking at Plastic Man as the guy who was just stretchy.
And it's funny as you mentioned that Identity Crisis, the Ralph that was in there went through all of this. Mm-hmm. So that was an era where they were referring to the Satellite Era, which that's what this is. This is the Satellite Era of Justice League. So you're right in connecting those two, because this is very much a younger, this is earlier years for that particular Ralph. Because they even reference back in Identity Crisis to the simpler times. This is the simpler times they're referencing. And it's cool to see these stories in the context of what you're talking about. It's where continuity matters, because when you go back to this story and go, well, this actually did happen. These characters actually did go through this, and it does in the future. That's what I love about what they've done right now with how there's this idea that these characters age slower, because of whatever mystical thing that happens. I'm fine with all of that, because what it means is that these classic stories all have relevance to modern stories. And it just explains how these characters have been able to live through eras. I'm cool with that. I know it's kind of a wacky thing I've got to now wrap my head around believing in, but it explain away why these stories actually happen, because to your point about maturity, you were seeing a character who evolved from this character to the more mature character that you remember from Identity Crisis and other storytelling that you've read. It's more fun when you can go back and go, well, he used to be like this. And he got there eventually. We saw this on the Flash TV show, right? With their handling of Ralph on that, where he was a character who evolved on that TV show. And it's more fun when you see the character evolve from seasons. Well, this is an earlier season for this character. Star-Spangled Kid is the one where Star-Spangled Kid and Stripesy were the team that Stargirl is kind of inheriting her stuff from. So It's fun to see him in this context. I like how they're faced with this barrier that they're trying to get through, and Superman can't get through it, and the kid's like, Superman, let me use my cosmic material. And Superman's like, I wouldn't try this. This thing just hit me. He got knocked back, and they started to realize, I like when these characters start to realize if we act as a team, you charge up Superman. Superman's thrown by Wonder Woman. We're now going to create this invulnerable missile that may blast us through. In that process, though, they take Superman out.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see the beginning of characters in this crew falling. It added a sense of danger to this, where it's like, well, okay, Superman's down. Now we're down to 7. How is this going to work out as we see characters falling along the way? And appropriately so, they're like, well, you've taken out your biggest one in Superman, right? So who do you got to take out next if you're going to really give us a sense of danger? Of course, Hawkman.
Yeah.
Because now that you're taking out Hawkman, it's like now you've got to really question whether or not these heroes can make it. Because if you'd left him till the end, it would have been like, of course they're going to win. Because Hawkman.
It'd be easy.
Of course, because Hawkman's still around. But once you take out Hawkman, joking aside, in this era, when this was around, I didn't appreciate Hawkman back in this era. I've become a huge fan now, but back then I didn't. It's another character, like I mentioned Aquaman before. Cool, he's this tough character with wings. I didn't quite understand him. It's funny how writers can finally explain a character to you, and then you see them in certain sequences in a very, very different light. Wonder Woman's the same way. I feel like my understanding now of Wonder Woman compared to 1980 me is a vastly different. Like seeing this story now, understanding this is the Golden Age Wonder Woman and everything she's been through. It's cool to see these stories now with a different understanding of the characters that you're reading than you had back in an earlier era. Because context is really big when it comes to getting behind a character, understanding their motivations, understanding even their dialogue. When she's shouting out Diana, I wouldn't have understood then, she's talking about gods and goddesses and things like that. Now I do. And it's like, oh, that's a neat little touch, showing her distinct differences from our Diana.
I'll tell you, it's one of the neat things about the sequences when they take out Soup. Then you go in there and Carter, gets taken out because he, it's that whole lashes out because of, he's so angry at what's going on. He's like, let's go. And he gets taken out. And then it slides into Diana doing her thing with the bracelets. Now, I'll tell you, I've said this multiple times in the show. As a kid, I did not really appreciate how cool of a character Wonder Woman is, because I was an idiot and she was a girl. So I'm like, I can't read those comic books. I can't like those things. That's a girl book. And now I'm looking back and you see this, these moments where they really do go into the Amazon and the warrior, but it's even beyond that, where she's the motivator. She's the one who's like, hey, we got this, guys. We keep going forward no matter what. And, even after defeat, is death so terrible? I'm like, man, that is awesome. Just the pure warrior. And she's jumping in there, firing, massive lasers. She's doing the blocking. And just, it was a neat thing where it was Diana solely on her own taking care of business. And she gets them through the line, and the very last shot gets her and takes her out. Like, oh! And again, I'm reading this going, oh, man, that is awesome. Because you're seeing the team get whittled down. And reading this at this point in time, I didn't realize it was going to be Ralph who was going to be the final hero left standing. And I should have, because they really did lay it out with Ralph being throughout the whole time going, what do we do now? Soup's down. Well, we move forward. What do we do now? We move forward. And it's always Ralph who's throwing out, hey, what do we do now? And it should have dawn on me that Ralph was going to be the final hero, but it was a neat thing seeing them go through step by step by step how they're taking out their powerful heroes, how they're going through this. But once again, we move forward. We keep going forward. It's like the old Flash fact. Flash is always run towards the danger, never away. And I love that, concept of the Flash, and that I love seeing that in these heroes. And this is something that, this story, as I said, it's a classic story, and it's something that, I could keep reading over and over again.
When you mention Wonder Woman, it's interesting, because I guess my question to you is, did you watch the Linda Carter show? Yeah, I mean, was that like a thing for you? Or because for me it was. I was like a huge fan of that show. So I will admit, my love of Wonder Woman came more from that show than it did. I liked her on Super Friends. I wasn't like anti her on Super Friends. I don't mean it that way. But it was really the show with Linda Carter, because she was the lead character that I came to appreciate her. But that was a regular, I didn't miss Wonder Woman. That was an important show. Now, was that not like a show? I mean, obviously you knew that Linda Carter was Wonder Woman. Did you watch that, or
not religiously?
Okay.
That was not, I did not watch her. I watched it, and there's a lot of episodes that I've gone back since and watched a lot of the series and all that, and there's a lot of episodes that I never saw.
Sure.
100%. And I'm like, I never saw that episode. And it was something, and again, it was partially because it was a female main character.
Cool.
Part of it was just, in our house we had one TV. So if everybody didn't want to watch it, you didn't watch it. So, siblings didn't want to watch Wonder Woman, and it was one of those things where it wasn't 100% priority, for the TV show, for the TV watching. So I didn't see them all. But also I wasn't like, I got to really watch this, because again, I didn't recognize how cool the character is, because there's so much more to Wonder Woman now that I see about. She's not just beating people up. She's got that whole where it's she solves the problems not with just with violence. She actually, and even in the TV show, there's a bunch of episodes I saw where she took down the bad guys not by beating them up, but with her compassion and with her, understanding, and just everything that she did, that makes her such a cool character. They captured that in the TV show, and that's something I wish I'd seen that as a kid. That would be like, oh, that's kind of neat. Or to be honest, it probably would have been lost on me as a kid. Knowing me, the way my brain was back then, I probably would have been like, no excitement. She didn't punch anybody. But that's just, the way I was when I was a kid. Now I see that kind of stuff, and I like the action sequences, but I also equally like these moments where it's not about the action. It's about, the hero stepping up. It's about them doing the right thing even when it's hard. There's so many cool stuff that happens in, especially in this era of comics, that when I go back and I reread some of this stuff that I completely missed as a child. If I read this back then, I would have completely missed all these little side stuff.
Yeah, Wonder Woman, it was funny. That TV show was one where I totally was glued to it. And because I was all in on superheroes at that stage. So when Wonder Woman hit, the idea of there being any superhero show that was really well done as a primetime TV show, and I was fortunate enough that my parents were like, cool. Like I think my mom was probably the saving grace with me and this kind of stuff, because she watched it with me. I vividly remember that as a kid. That was a not missed show for me, because it was superhero adventures occurring on TV. I think it opened my mind. I mean, I was a weird, quirky kid anyway. You gave me a superhero show where it was like really well done on TV, because we're used to that being kind of a thing right now where there's so much superhero stuff, it's hard to keep up with all of it. And I'm talking about there's so much superhero content that's really well done that's out there now that it's hard. Comic book content that's out there now that's really well done, because it's not all superhero. That we are in an era right now, probably a golden age of content. We didn't have that as kids. And the ability to go back to your point, it's if you missed the destination time, you're done. There was the first shot of watching it, then there was the reruns. And if you didn't catch either of those, and usually when we watched reruns, it wasn't reruns of a show that you missed. it was a reruns of a show that was your favorite because for some reason you missed an episode along the way or two, you know?
Right.
So you would watch that show again, watching for the second time favorite episodes and coming back and eventually hoping to catch the ones that you missed before the next season began. Because that was your only shot. And that was it. So you didn't usually go to a program that you didn't watch in that rerun sequence. You were usually watching one of your favorites. Or if it was summer, we were outside. It's kind of, I mean, it was, am I right? Yeah. Wasn't that kind of a thing? We were like, it was, because the programs that we watched that were in prime time was at that primo, like, 8 o'clock time slot. If it was a 9 o'clock show that would come on, like, during the summer, if you were out with friends, you were in the process of coming home when that 9 o'clock show was running. So you didn't really in the summer catch them during reruns, right? Is that kind of like the experience?
Oh, yeah, come home when the streetlights come on.
That's right.
That used to be the rule.
Yep.
You know, as the streetlights were starting to come on, that's when you had to come home. You know, this was the era before VCRs, way before DVRs, any of that stuff. So you either caught it or you didn't. And if you missed it, then maybe, you know, summer reruns, maybe you would see that. You know, but to be honest, there was a ton of shows that I know as a kid that I missed. That, you know, there's like A-Team was a must-watch show.
Yep.
And that was a must-watch show in our family. So I've seen every A-Team episode there is. I guarantee you that.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, like, as I said, Wonder Woman shows, there's a lot of other shows that I know I missed. I know there's episodes I didn't see. You know, and it's just because, you know, the nature of when we're growing up, there's a lot more different stuff we used to do. We used to be a lot more. I used to be a lot more physically active than I am now. You know? And sometimes I'd like to go back to those days. Now we got to physically work out. You know, whereas before we were playing. You know,
yes.
And that's how we got our workout because we were just running around playing with our friends and riding bikes around. Various sports and all this type of physical activity that we used to do just for the fun of it. Now, as adults, we actually have to focus and exercise.
It's the other thing that would drive shows was playground talk.
Yeah.
You know, like if you knew that we were going to talk about it at the playground, you made sure you watched the show so you could be part of the discussion. That's where like shows like at the time was Dukes of Hazzard and the Hulk were ones that we went to different, because you went to Upson, right?
Yeah.
So I went to St. Williams, but I mean, I think we were all kind of like there were certain must-watch programs because everybody was going to talk about it at the playground, so you had to be a part of the discussion. So it's funny how peer influences kind of drove all of that. But that was my exposure to Wonder Woman was really that television program, much more than I watched every episode of Super Friends, and I liked her on Super Friends, but it was really the live-action Wonder Woman TV show that made me love the character. And it was if I hadn't watched that and loved it so much, I still would have gone to the George Perez run because of his run on Titans. At that point, I was such a fan of his run on New Teen Titans, that I would have followed him to Wonder Woman just because I followed because of Perez. I would say more so than even Wonder Woman, except for that once I read that first issue of the Perez run, I'm like, oh, this is who Wonder Woman is? Oh yeah, and it probably tapped into some of my love from her from the Linda Carter show, but I think George Perez took it to 11, and that understanding. It's funny to read these characters. The Flash was one as a kid too. He was the fast character. I remember him from Super Friends, but I didn't know the Flash really well. I often reference Wally West as being my Flash. Barry has become it now in later years once I started understanding the concept, I read older stuff, and I love Barry just as much as I love Wally. But the first Flash that I really followed was the Mark Waid run of the Flash. When Mark Waid took over, I started hearing good things. And I'm like, well, this is Kid Flash, Wally West, which I remembered from Teen Titans. And I'm like, oh, well, I love Wally. Let me start reading this, and became a huge Flash fan. So in this era, I enjoyed having the colorful character, the Flash, the speedster on the team. He was really fast, but I wasn't like a diehard Flash fan. And now it's fun to go back and read these stories and know that, it's the police scientist, Barry Allen, and, what his role is on the team when he's on there, and what his power set brings to the table. It's not just speed. He can do so much more. with what he can do. And he's somebody during these cosmic events you'd want on the scene because he's done time travel and those type of things. So it's really cool. It's funny watching these members of the team fall because we're at the point right now where all we've got left is Star-Spangled Kid, Huntress, Dr. Midnight, and Elongated Man. I don't know if I'm the Lord of Time at this point, and my plan was to have these characters kind of finally take this guy down, take down my computer, I would be getting a little worried.
I'd be getting very worried right now.
Because my plan's falling apart.
Especially once you see 3 of the 4 remaining get taken out by one punch.
Right. By this crazy robot that they put out there.
Well, and is this an actual... That's the thing. Is this an actual robot, or is this one of those living entity robots?
I don't know.
Because the way I'm reading it, initially it's a robot, but then as his dialogue is going on, this is a sentient being that Ralph just rips apart.
Right.
And again, these 2 pages were awesome. Seeing Ralph have this gut check moment of saying, you know what? I know I'm just a circus clown, but guess what? I got to step up. We've been outclassed, we've been defeated, but that doesn't matter. All that matters is going on. And I loved how when they focused in on Ralph, he goes from being that goofy face to that very serious, determined look. And that's when he rips apart this robot out of all pieces, and he's like, okay, I got to take this down. And it was absolutely a wonderful sequence because even as he's going through this, he doesn't really completely realize that the big bad that brought him here didn't you take out the computer that he's about to short circuit. He's sitting there saying, hey, he's right in front of that computer. If I short that, maybe it'll knock him out and we'll win. No, the whole point was to short out the computer, Ralph.
The thing is, as the computer shorts out, and I loved the countdown. Like, at this point, Ralph does not have the luxury of thinking. He has to move. He has to react. There is no time for him to deviate from the course of action. There is a countdown going on that's intense. And if he doesn't make it there, and it's only, like, you needed the stretchy character because of the fact that he was able to cover a lot of ground in quick time and be able to navigate through any form of thing put in the way from him. I mean, it was literally, he stretched himself to the very last second to be able to stop it. It was 5 seconds, I think, by the time he blew that thing up. That countdown was intense. Like, it was a really cool ending. And we're left with the fact that, because of the explosion in there, he was knocked out. If Aquaman had not revived everyone, they would still be trapped there.
Right.
So it's cool how the story ends, and you see that great, quaint moment with him and Sue. I loved that about DC, where you'd go back and you have you have these heroes who have these colorful costumes that are I'm on the Justice League, this really big, powerful team. But then what they were doing, and I think a lot of this was supposedly in response to Marvel, but I think it was to the benefit of DC, trying to find a way to make your characters more relatable by showing us what they're like outside of their costumes was really a benefit to these stories. Jerry Conway did a very nice job of balancing this in. Intermixed throughout the story, you get to see them be really human. At the end of the story, you get to see them be really human. And it was something that really benefited because I felt like we got to know these characters and love them in a way that I think it's where the competition between the 2 companies only benefited us as readers. It's when they are responsive to each other without trying to be each other. I think that's where the universes of DC and Marvel are at their best. Trying to mimic each other, you become a watered down version of the other. So it's when I hear things like saying that DC should do what Marvel's done with the MCU. I don't know that I want that. I mean, I'm not against them having a continuity and a storytelling continuity in there. I think that could be cool, but I do want them to do it in their own way because I think Marvel's nailing it with the MCU. I love the MCU. Respect if there's people who maybe don't like some of the newer, like Black Widow. I saw some negative comments about that. Black Widow was awesome. I'm sorry. I had a lot of fun with that movie. I've been loving the TV shows. Saw Loki most recently. That was sweet. I love the MCU. I equally love the DC movies as they come out, and I'm fine if they come up with their own continuity or take another stab at continuity to try and drum up a universe, a DC movie universe. I don't need that though. I just need really good movies. I'm fine with that. So I I don't really largely care which route that they go, but I haven't been dissatisfied with the DC movies that have been coming out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I think the comic universes, there's something to be learned by what worked back in this era. I think they were at their strongest when they weren't trying to be each other, but they were impacted by each other in the sense that, oh, they're doing this and they're finding some success over there. How do we tap into that without being that? And I think these are stories that show an influence from Marvel in the sense that the character-driven nature of them, where we got to see them both in and out of costume, was something that I think was growing during this time. These were two great issues. Now, it's funny, this issue was 50 cents, right? And I think that references the 44 pages that were there that you were talking about earlier. The next issue, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, is 40 cents. So I don't know if the page count wound up being different at this point, but we were buying comics in the late 70s at 40 cents, dude. Which, that was a lot at that time, though. So you put it in perspective, 40 cents was not, I mean, like, I got one book at 40 cents if I was lucky.
And I remember, it's funny because you think about it now, but back when I was a kid, I didn't have the budget to buy multiple books.
No.
And they're like, 50 cents, 40 cents, like, oh, man.
And wait, and if parents bought you a book for 40 cents, like, that was a nice gift.
Yeah.
That you got at the time. I mean, and I'm just putting in perspective, like, that wasn't something where, like, well, here's $5. Like, you get $1, and it was like a big deal. My grandmother, I remember we would do some work over at her house, and I'm just putting this in context. This is when I was a kid, $1 meant something. I don't mean it that way, but we would get an allowance for my grandma. I remember walking out with $1, and you could buy like an action figure for that. You know, so if you sacrificed that $1 for a comic, you were giving up buying a Mego action figure.
Yep.
Because you could do that at that time. So it's, or close. Maybe my dad might have coughed up some cash towards it, but these things were not as expensive. I'm not saying that a Mego figure was $1, but I'm sure it wasn't too far off in comparison to today. So it's interesting to see these cover prices in comparison to 2021 cover prices for comics. And I'm not knocking comics for being the price that they are now. I understand the production behind the scenes, and they're also not doing the numbers that they were back then. So you're dealing with a different production cost back then. I don't know what comic creators were being paid back then. I'm sure in comparison to maybe the heights of what we were seeing with the speculator market and all that, I don't think they were getting paid what they should have been, in my mind, during that era. But comics were making a lot more money back then because of the fact that everyone was reading them. I mean, there was a big market for this. They were flying off of shelves. It was like, if you missed it, you missed it. And so it's interesting to look back at these 40-cent price points and realize that was a pretty aggressive price point at the time for comics. I wonder what magazines were in. I'd like to look up what magazines were in perspective, but in comparison. But it's interesting.
Carter Hall, scientific genius from a far-off world, flies into action as Hawkman.
So, Jim, as we're jumping into issue 171 of Justice League of America, I remember this cover. I don't know that I read this, though. It's one of those things where, kind of to our discussion before, and I think it was an interesting context, was I didn't have the money to be able to get every comic that was coming out. Same problem that, we had as I got into college and even started teaching. The difference was, at that time, you relied heavily on, did you have an allowance? Did your parents give you money? What other things were you buying with that allowance? It is kind of the same problem we have today. It wasn't that there were, and it's a testament to comics, it wasn't that there wasn't other competition for our dollars. There was all kinds of toys and things and activities and even candy that you would have to make the choice of going for. Because remember, we were in the area where Saturday morning cartoons, right, were swamped with ads for candy. So you go into I remember going into, like, I'll use French's Pharmacy as an example again. They had a whole candy aisle. So you're sitting there, do I want the pack of Big League Chew, or do I want to get a comic right now? Or, will I get lucky enough that, like, my dad or mom will fork over a little bit of money and I can do a little bit of A and a little bit of B, which often it was A or B that you would go for. I will say more often than not when it was A or B, I'd go for the comic. This cover, I remember, I did not read this. I know because I would have remembered this story, especially if I read it on a cliffhanger. But this is a good one because it's a murder mystery. It's pretty, intense for a murder mystery for this era. I mean, we're talking late 70s, and there's a lot of depth to this one where, I mean, they really killed a hero in this. Yes. I mean, this wasn't like one where the end of the story is some resolution where the hero comes back to life. A hero died in this story. It's funny how we talk about how much more edgy the stories are today and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, I don't know, dude. 1978, and they killed off character in this. And it really happened. That's a pretty big landmark two-parter that they did here in this one. And this is a story that is unique in the fact that we don't really see 100% of a resolution at the end. There's two different events going on at the end of this that I'm pretty sure the next issue is going to cover one of them. But I don't know if there's a story told that takes care of the other one of them. It's a very unique story in its handling in that there's a lot that goes on here. There's a murder mystery with a murderer in this. Did you guess the murderer?
Not really, no.
Neither did I. And I think they teased it pretty well. Yeah.
One of the things, again, with the stories from this period, I would have assumed, I'll figure it out. They'll telegraph it. And they didn't really do a job of telegraphing who the actual bad guy was, who the actual person was the murderer. Now, once they started piecing it together, and I started figuring it out eventually, but it wasn't like, I saw this the whole time coming. Because as we get to it, I'll tell you who I initially was thinking it was. I was thinking it was Power Girl initially. And that was the obvious, when they started laying everything out, that was like the obvious choice of who it was, and that's who it wasn't. And I was like, I was, throughout this whole thing, I was thinking it was her.
I thought her. I thought maybe Red Tornado, in the sense that something overtook Red Tornado. And because I thought it was somebody with a cape because of the way that they were teasing it. And then another part of me was loosely thinking, did somebody control Superman? Those were my three suspects as we were going through. And I was probably leaning more towards Red Tornado than Power Girl. But I totally get where, Power Girl had to be in the conversation because of the way that they were leaning. This is a cool story, and I actually like the art styling and the approach to this one. Like, when you flip The Murderer Among Us, Crisis Above Earth 1, that opening splash where they're going through the roll call and that center image of it was really edgy. I really liked the choices in this. This was a compelling story. It felt like, I'm a big fan of Hitchcock films and stuff like that. It had kind of a vibe of that kind of thing in, being one of the Hitchcock mysteries. I totally appreciated the stylings and the choices of this. Boy, Jerry Conway and the art team were really hitting it out of the park in these stories. And it's a true pleasure to jump into one of these where, I do remember the cover. I do not remember the content in between. And, man, this was a page-turner. And the lineup was cool because we got to see the two different versions of Hawkman in this. And we got Katar Hall, which was the space cop on our Earth. And Carter Hall, the archaeologist, was on the other Earth. Now, Katar Hall did adopt an identity on Earth, but he really was the spaceman who came to Earth, whereas the reincarnated guy, the Carter Hall, was the Earth 2 guy from the Golden Age. So it was interesting to see both of them, and, believe me as a geeky Hawkman fan now, because I'm a huge Hawkman fan now, this was very welcome to have the characters. The whole lineup is like a who's who squad of just really cool characters. This is what made me, if you read this and you're like, Sean, why have you been such a DC devotee? It's stories like this. Growing up when they had roll calls and rosters and you got to see a rotating cast of characters and you sometimes got the opportunity to deal with Justice Society characters being thrown into the mix, I geeked out over this because smorgasbord of colorful characters with different really cool background stories. Being a fan of time travel stories and other dimensions, I was just as much of a sci-fi fan as I was a comic book fan growing up and fantasy fan. This kind of blended all of that kind of stuff together. Now you got me a murder mystery thrown into this whole thing. Oh, you got me. Yeah. It really, really got me.
And I'll tell you, when we first started reading this thing, I was assuming, oh, okay, it's just going to be a swerve. Didn't think they were actually killing somebody off, or the killing wasn't going to stick or something. No, they actually did that. That was the thing that really shocked me on this. And like you, with this roll call page, I do like these roll call pages. Like Legion of Superheroes does this as well. And I really appreciate it with that because I really don't know the names of the people. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I need that roll call sheet to help guide me through it. But it was funny because I remember when I first read this, I was looking through this and just, the look of the characters, Zatanna's look back in this era is dramatically different than how she looks now. And I'll be honest, I like it. I'm not going to knock it. I think it looks cool. Yep. Power Girl, again, she's got that 70s, 80s poof hair kind of thing going. So I was like, man, here you go. That's that style of that period. So it was something that I was like, man, this looks cool. Some people are classic look. Batman's Batman. Like Green Lantern, both the Green Lanterns. That's the way they've always looked. So some of these different characters, I liked that. And I appreciated the two Hawkmen having the dramatically different looking style to them. Because one, it makes it easier for me to pick out which one's which. But also, again, it's that nod to this was this character, this is that character. When we had the two Wonder Womans, whenever we have the stories that have the two Wonder Womans in it, they're drawn so similarly that it does throw me off. So when we talked about the last story, when the one Wonder Woman was knocked out, I appreciated that even more because we only had the one Wonder Woman, so I knew which one it was. Like with the two Hawkmen, I can clearly see which one's Hawkman. Flashes, you can clearly see. Lanterns, you can clearly see which one's which. So it's kind of I'm glad when we have these dramatic looks that are different, but also I do appreciate just the throwback in time, to this era and this time period and this historically accurate representation of what was the hairstyle and just the general style of society at the time.
Yeah, and it's funny that you're picking up the Power Girl piece because that's my introduction to Power Girl was during this era. That it seems like she evolved from that for me. To your point, you're seeing. I didn't realize. I'm very observant that from your exposure to her, your introduction to her, she would look a little different here because of the fact that the hairstyling's different and stuff. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even notice that. Because for me, it was so second nature to see her this way. When they're all sitting and hanging out and the fire's burning and all that, as a kid, I loved this kind of stuff. It's like a dream, right? To be there hanging out with your friends and they're these heroes. I mean, it's like when you think of like hanging out with actors or things like that now, who have been in movies and you're like, well, that'd be kind of cool to hang out with them or TV stars and, be able to just rap and chill out and hang like, your best friends. We all like dream of these kind of things. When you're put in this mood, you feel that they're three-dimensional characters that you can hang out with. And it was cool to have her be the chairman of this joint meeting between the two teams as the newest member of the team. And I like how that she kind of gives us a context of who she is and what her role is with the team. She's getting advice from some of the veterans who are out there. She's talking about some of her own uncertainties. He's like, the League is a highly competent team of individuals working together for the mutual benefit of our mutual trust. And if you hadn't proved yourself as independent, do you believe you would have been asked to join? He's basically telling her, you're this independent woman who's like proven that you belong as part of this team. This was pretty, to your points earlier about how where our society was at that time, this was pretty edgy. Because Marvel was doing stuff like this, too, with characters like Storm, being the leader of the X-Men and things like that. You started seeing these characters who were taking on a much more prominent role. It was cool to see comics kind of advancing how they were utilizing strong female characters. It was a slow-moving process. Let's be serious about it. I mean, just like society has been very slow-moving in the process. But at the time, a lot of my foundational years of getting used to strong females, believing in strong females, and I think it's helped me in my profession. I work in education, which is a predominantly female profession. Being able to respect strong female leaders has been something that I think comes from comics. I mean, because a lot of the role modeling of that has been where comics were starting to show these characters in leadership roles. And it's something that I think is still being worked on. I'm not saying that, boy, they hit it out of the park every single time. I think there's times where it's gotten it wrong, too, that has certainly been well referenced. But I do think comics were making strides in dabbling in this and making attempts in this. And it's kind of cool growing up that it was a medium that was not afraid to take some chances and play around in these areas, because I think as a reader, I think I benefited from that. Is kind of where I'm going with this. But it's really cool. We jump from this kind of hangout into Mr. Terrific telling us a story about how he came out of retirement. I liked the idea that these are characters who, they are older. They've been around longer. They've done all of this before. He had stepped aside and now had become a teacher. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool. He's doing that. There was a professor, and this is setting up the whole storyline here of this professor who did this experiment where he vanished and disappeared, us having no idea that vanishing and disappearing meant that he could take over others. He is bound and determined that he needs to be here because this old enemy of his is a danger. He seems to know what is coming. I can't tell you the truth yet about him. And you're like sitting here like, well, dude, maybe if you had said something more here, this story would have gone in a different direction for you.
Thank you. Because I'll tell you, I love this story. So I'm not knocking the story.
No, I'm not either.
That was the first thought that popped in my head when I was reading this. Like, why didn't you tell him that? Even when I was first reading this through, after we see what happens, you 100% can say, hey, you should have told him. But you know me, I'm a big fan of calling for backup. I'm a big fan of letting everybody know what's going on. Right here, this conversation, if before they adjourned the meeting, you said, excuse me, I'd like to make a point here, and then drop all this information on everybody right then and there, this would be a dramatically different story, especially for him.
When you learn the truth, one of you will be branded a traitor. And it's like, well, that's great. But, so, at this time, did he know that Jay Garrick?
I was assuming he knew.
So he tracked him down.
And that's why he's there. I'm assuming he was there because Jay's there.
Right. So,
but, again, if he knew Jay, why is he, because he's having a conversation with the two Flashes.
Right.
If he knows Jay isn't Jay, why would he tell him, hey, I know who you are? It's one of those things like I have thrown around, what was he thinking? Because, again, you think about it, superheroes, all of them have like these little weaknesses or little quirks that, get him into trouble. And his very easily could be because he was a retired hero. Coming out of retirement, he had to be the one to solve the case. That could be the thing, even when they give him the grief, because it's actually, it's Jay who tells him, hey, I've dealt with King Spirit before. You could have called me. I would have handled it. He's like, what, are you saying I can't handle it? So maybe he didn't know that Jay was the villain. Maybe he right there didn't know, and he's still trying to figure it out. But again, if you got to let go sometimes, you got to ask for help. You got to call him for backup. You got to do it, work it as a team. And maybe things would be better for old Terry.
Here's a tell that we never caught. I didn't catch it, at least. And look at this panel right here. It's on the same page. And for a moment, those who have heard the defender of fair play's ominous words stare after him in uneasy silence. Perhaps some of them wonder if age has affected his mind. Look who's absent from that picture.
Yeah.
Jay Garrick's not in that picture.
Jay Garrick's not in the picture, yeah.
And it's cool to see that now, but it's, wow. Here's the thing that I think is brilliant about this story, and I think it's smart. And I think what we're feeling is what we should be feeling. And this is where it's an edgy story. And I think this is a very, very smart story. I think we're supposed to feel this way. I think we're supposed to be questioning, should Mr. Terrific have handled this differently? I think it was a very, very smart story for the time. Because I think it makes this more human and more real, right? Because this would happen in the real world, where he thinks the best way for him to handle this is keeping things close to his vest for right now. It's so not.
Right.
We know that. We know that he could have handled this differently, and more than likely it would have handled it differently. But I think this is what makes it such a compelling story, is the debate. Then we flash from that to talk about continuity. Talk about you talk about character progression, right? from the last story that we just read to this one, further character progression because Batman at Earth 1 has died now at this point. These two are dealing with this together where she's for the first time encountering Uncle Bruce, who is a younger version from a different Earth of her dad. How hard must that be to be in that moment where you're sitting there with him and he doesn't know, he wants to support her, wants to console her. He's met this other Batman, so knows what his life was like, envies him to a certain extent, as we've seen, envies his having a daughter and feels that connection, that familial connection with her that's unexplained in these moments. You just have this really quaint moment that is referencing something that has happened in another comic book. Whether you read that comic book or not, they tell you enough so you've been brought up to speed. Have you ever read that story?
Which?
The Death of the Earth 2 Batman?
No.
It's available. You can search for it. There's actually been collections of it. It occurred in Adventure Comics. So this is accessible and easy. You can actually read the story. So the story exists. And, I mean, obviously it exists. But it happened in Adventure Comics. There is a collection that I believe it's called The Death of the Earth 2 Batman. That's out there. And it has not only that story, but some stories leading up to it. It's well worth seeking out, and it gives context to this in a very, very cool way. So it's worth seeing. But you don't have to have read that to have this accessible because of the way that this is written. And such a human moment in here that you didn't have to throw this in here, but throwing it in here made this world feel richer, right? I mean, what a great sequence this is.
Well, I absolutely love this full page, because again, the last issues we were talking about how I liked how Bruce was sitting there going through his mind, saying, how he was envious of the other Batman for having this daughter. He loved having Dick as his ward, but he always wanted a daughter.
Yep.
He's like, and there was even like the one where I think it trailed off. Maybe if Silver, and he was thinking, what if could have happened with Silver, Silver St. Cloud and all that, and it kind of like trailed off there. It's seeing this go through, and I even like how he even he acknowledges, hey, I feel just numb, because again, this is going back to Bruce's childhood. With watching his parents get shot and killed, that traumatic event that made him Batman. It's tying back to that. I love just again this era of Batman where he's not the brooding Batman. He is an approachable person. He's Uncle Bruce here. This is not the intimidated, scary Batman that no one talks to. And I like the fact that they had this moment where she's like, "Just hold me, just hold me for a little while." And I was like, that is just a great, tender moment between these two. And I absolutely loved seeing this in here because these two work so well together. These are some great, this is a great story that these two would have. I would read a book of, Earth 1, Batman, Earth 2, Huntress. I would read that book, just because the playoff these two have with each other.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Speaking of playoffs, Hawkman and Dr. Fate. This is the Earth 1 Hawkman and the Earth 2 Dr. Fate, and they're connecting over archaeology. It's interesting how, he's talking about, hey, I was a policeman on Thanagar, and this is like my job here. He kind of like, it's kind of my way of hiding that I'm Hawkman here, but I've become very interested in this, and I'd love to pick your brain. This is what I do as a job now. That dialogue, while this silly sequence is going on behind where we've got the Green Lanterns pulling snacks over by them, it was cool because there's this real conversation going on between the two where you can see, like, dude, I've been wanting to sit down and talk to you. But then Dr. Fate points out, I'm two separate entities. Like, there's Kent Nelson, but then there's me, Dr. Fate, and I'm actually somebody different. I'm a different entity. In this moment, you get to know just another layer to these characters that were fascinating. I love these stories because it's why, to this day, I'm still such a fan of this universe, because these are the foundational years for me of getting to know the DC universe. It's like, why am I such a diehard fan today and a sponge when we bring back these characters and get to see new explorations of them? It's because of these stories. I mean, this is the kind of stuff I was reading as a kid and going, oh, this is cool. And to this day, this is a story that I didn't read. And I am shocked at how like cool and edgy this story was. Because I was really afraid more of our conversation was going to revolve around, I don't want to say being apologetic because that's never a thing, but more talking about like the areas where we struggled to get through this because of some dated concepts and things. I didn't find that at all. Like, I mean, yeah, there was some dialogue, but it was passing where it was just kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter because there's so much cool stuff going on right now. Like, yay. This story is so good. I mean, this is a really good, like, this is one that will be a reread for me, like, soon. Just because I really enjoyed it that much. So this will be on my short list of stories that I want to go back to, like the collection. I actually will say in general will be one that I'll go back to. And I was so pleasantly surprised by the first two stories, which if I read the first one, it was loosely. And this one, I know I did not read this one. I saw the cover, but I never read it.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you, I really did not have any issues with the dialogue at all on any of these things. Any of the stories we're covering. And with each one of these, I think they could redo it. This 100% on the other one. But this one, again, this is another one where they 100% could redo this story modern day. And again, with, as I said before, just updates to how the characters look to fit in the current universe, you could tell this story again. Or, as you said even before, animated. This could be an animated as is. This was a great whodunit story. And I love how they were leaving misdirections. Because one of the reasons I thought it was Power Girl was because of the sequence, when the first explosion first happens, and Clark is like, I wanted to have a word with Kara before much time passed, but she's not here. Where'd she go? And that right there, as soon as I read that sequence, I'm like, okay, Kara's going to be, something's up with Kara being the bad guy.
So to your point on this one, look who else isn't there.
Exactly.
Red Tornado.
I didn't notice that.
So it was yes to everything you're saying. So she becomes a suspect and he becomes a suspect. When I started to think there was somebody else controlling the situation, it's why I briefly thought maybe Superman because of the cape, because they referenced the cape. I'm like, okay, did somebody take over Superman? I didn't think it was Superman that did it. I thought he was overtaken. And I mean, Superman was like my way, like I was convinced either Power Girl, then pretty much neck and neck was Red Tornado. Superman was like a distant choice because I'm like, would they go as far as Superman? I don't know. Maybe, maybe he's the obvious choice and that's why it's him. And that was when I was thinking still that Mr. Terrific might be alive. I didn't think they'd really kill him, and keep him killed. I thought the resolution of this is going to be Mr. Terrific was alive. Here's what I don't know. I don't know if there's a follow-up story to this where that's how it ends. Maybe they do save Mr. Terrific if there's a story after this. I don't know where this goes. I am chomping at the bit to find out if there is because I believe that there was a JSA book going on at this time. All-Star Squadron, I think, was running at this time. I don't know. I have to look. But I don't know. Or maybe there was a story that took place in Adventure Comics or something like that with it. I don't know. I don't know what books were running concurrently with this, and I'm going to have to research it. Because I want to find out if this story went anywhere. Because it ends in a cliffhanger. Like, the whole two-parter ends in this, cliffhanger that, I want to know what happened.
Yes.
And we're in a unique era where we can seek that out and actually read where this goes. Like you, I want to read the JLA issues that were in between this story arc. These story arcs. Because I've really become a fan of this run. So this has done a great job of opening my eyes to just how cool this run was.
Oh, big time. And it's funny because the sequence here, when we have the initial explosion and everything going on, I do like seeing some of the heroes grabbing on and they're planning and they're like, the fact that the satellite had the automatic repair mechanism to seal up the hole and this and that. But I like seeing the two Hawkmans go into action working together.
Yep.
And the one even's saying, "Hey, don't fight it, you'll break your wings, just let it sweep you along." And it was kind of neat seeing the two Hawkmen work together in conjunction, and later on we see the two Lanterns work together. That was something that I really appreciated on this issue where each of the two counterparts are working together.
But do you see where this is a good story though, Jim?
Yeah.
Because it's putting them in the right order in your mind. Because you're saying first, I like seeing the two Hawkmen working together. And then secondarily, that I like seeing the two Green Lanterns work together. It's really good quality storytelling. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
You had to go for it.
Well, no, I could have resisted, but I didn't.
You wouldn't be you if you did.
No, it was... Yeah. I was seeing them with Dr. Fate, though, because Dr. Fate, I actually mentioned on the show multiple times. I didn't mean to cut you off either. I'll let you go back, and I'm sorry. Seeing Dr. Fate work with them as well, to your point, it was just a really cool sequence, because I've always been fascinated by Dr. Fate. He has a really cool... I don't know, are you into is Dr. Fate a character that's on your radar of being interested in? I know I'm going back to the kid me. This era, when I'd see him in crossovers, he was kind of an enigma. So my interest in him was just in knowing more because I didn't know much about him, and there wasn't really a vehicle for me to get to know much about him other than crossovers. Is he a character that's of interest to you?
He's one of those that I don't really think about, but then when I start reading stories about him, I'm like, oh, that's kind of a cool character. Like when they had that revamp of who Dr. Fate was, and it was that one med student. I can't think of his name. I read that. I was like, oh, that's kind of neat. I was kind of enjoying it. Philippe. But it didn't have any I didn't have any loyalty to it. I wouldn't have been like, oh, we must keep this going, Whereas like with Superman, I've got loyalty, too, and even Bats, I've got the loyalty to those characters. So Fate is an interesting character that I'm like, I like stories with him, and like this issue in particular was a really good, Dr. Fate story where it's showing what all the extra stuff he could do. Because I liked when he and Soup go into space and they gather the asteroids that have the nickel in it, and then they melt it down, and then Fate forms it into a patch for the side of the satellite. And I thought that was a really cool combo, showing those two together, and I appreciated that it was Soup and Dr. Fate doing it, because it furthered my, hey, where's Power Girl? Why isn't the Superman equivalent out there with Superman? And instead we got the magic user. And I thought that was a really good tool to again add to the suspicion that the killer is Power Girl. I thought that was a neat thing to do.
Yeah, very good point. It was, and Red Tornado similarly was one of the reasons why I thought that they were. Part of me thought that they were leaning it towards Power Girl to swerve you, and Red Tornado was really the one.
Right.
If that makes any sense. I mean,
no, I can see why you thought Red Tornado. To be honest with you, but again, my whole mindset was focused on Power Girl.
Wait,
I just didn't know why.
And truthfully, I'm following your logic, so I'm not. This isn't me disputing you. It was more of I was following a similar logic chain, but I was like, well, maybe they're trying to swerve us over there, and I wasn't necessarily sold on either or. It was more that was one part of the mystery that I liked. That I was everything we're both saying. It's not a right and wrong. It's more of what was investing you in the mystery, and it really is along the way you're trying to figure it out. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. What matters is that you care enough about the story that you're trying to find the killer.
Yeah.
And we both were doing that, which is a sign of the story's success. I want to shout out real quick a shop that I was just at yesterday, as a matter of fact. It's the Toys That Time Forgot. It's in Canal, Fulton, Ohio. It's a comic book toy store. It's a comic book store. It's a full comic book shop. But equally is just classic toys, statues. I mean, they have everything from geek culture in there. My wife and I went yesterday. We were going on a boat ride at Canal Fulton. The boat was pulled by draft horses along the canal, and we went there for that purpose. And they moved our time from 1:30 to 2:45 because the horses needed a break because of how hot the day was. It was very hot and sticky. It served the purpose of being able to mosey around town, and it's this quaint little town. As we were walking around, I came across. So needless to say, it was like glowing. It was this. And it's this really cool shop. I mean, like loaded with stuff. I felt bad for my poor wife. I could have been there for hours, literally for hours. And I'm going to do my own road trip back there alone, where I don't have to put her through it, where I can just go through and I'm going to do some shopping there and purchasing, because it really was just. I mean, you can if you're looking for it, they've got it. I mean, and I'm talking about classic stuff straight on through. They had stuff from Star Wars, from Disney, from the old action figures, and the new versions of them, like the Mego toys. Figures Toy Company has gotten the license over the years to make some of the new. They're the Mego style characters, but DC characters that were never made into Mego style characters. They carry them there. They have a lot of the DC Direct statues, like the Batman black and white ones. They had ones there that I hadn't seen before. The danger of, actually, I guess the more judicious thing of having my wife there is I wasn't as inclined to spend as I normally would be. But I'm going to go back because I have to. The shop was, they had busts, statues, action figures. Clearly they have older classic things and everything up to current today. It was fun to just browse around. The people there were so nice. It's a family-run shop. So the father owns it. And I heard the younger guy who was there mentioned that it was his dad's shop. So it's kind of cool that it's family owned and operated, and it's just neat. It's a neat shop and well worth making a trek to go see. So it's the Toys That Time Forgot, and it's in Canal Fulton, Ohio. And the Toys Time Forgot. I'm sorry, take that out of it. The Toys Time Forgot in Canal Fulton, Ohio. I just want to shout it out because it was a cool shop, a really cool shop. And I'm that geeky guy that the second that I see a comic toy shop, I got to go in and see what's there. And this was well worth it, and will get a return visit from me because it was that cool. So if you're in the area and or if you're not, make the trek. It's worth the trek. And
let me know when you go.
I will, because it's a destination, and it's a cool place to go. You can go get lunch there. And there's a park that's right by there. It's like you can actually make it a destination for making a nice afternoon of going out there. So it's not something where you're just going to go to the shop and leave. You can go to the shop and actually hang out in the town. It's a cool little local place. So we're dealing with Terry Sloan being dead. They don't have time to mourn. They've got to deal with the issue at hand. And I loved seeing that in order to resolve this monumental explosion, it required the fast action of a number of heroes. And the teamwork aspect, seeing it over multiple pages and seeing how the different power sets work together, I thought was a really cool part of this before they could even get to the murder mystery. And I liked the attention to detail on that. You have to convince us that this was a big enough event that we would need some time before they could even get to analyzing the mystery. I liked that quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. And again, as we've been saying, attention to detail and just a little extra in that team dynamic. This is a really good balance on using all of these different characters. And again, it was cool showing the different characters side by side, especially with the Green Lanterns. When they were talking about the two lanterns, how the one ring is ancient magic and the other one's science beyond man's imagination. Yet both are skilled in their tools and what is done very quickly. And I was like, the little extra stuff that they didn't need to say, they added into it. And I was like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And I liked it. In exploring the mystery, we had people using different power sets, or, you had obviously our people that were police or detective procedural related that were analyzing it. We had your magic users that were using their power. Everyone's all hands on deck trying to figure out what happened. The further mystery is when Zatanna gets hit, taken out of action because of the whole thing. Her pupils are dilated. She's in a coma because of what happened. And we get that side shot. I geeked out of these as a kid. I still geek out. That satellite's huge.
Yes.
And the flashes.
Showing all the different rooms. And as a kid, this is the kind of thing I wish they would have made a toy for. I'm like, oh, man, I wish I had that toy.
My favorite toy as a kid was my Batman Wayne Foundation Mego playset, and I had to repurchase it years later, and I've got it. Again, the full-blown version of it. It's set up in my office here now. It's a display piece now for me, but, man, dude, I loved this kind of stuff. And you're right. If there was a satellite playset, I so would have been begging for it as a kid, because it's cool. The satellite is sweet. And you want to be on it, right? And running around in room to room. Well, did you ever play... You didn't play DC Universe Online, did you?
No.
Okay. It's free to play on your PlayStation, so if you ever want to jump into it, you don't have to pay anything to jump into it. You can run around on the JLA satellite, so it's a reason alone to jump in on thing. It's the more modern version of it, but it's still the JLA satellite, which is way cool. It is something you can play casually, and the fact that you can play it for free, I'm just shouting it out that it's something now that it's one of those games that went free to play. Like there's paid tiers that if you get into it are worth doing. You can do a monthly subscription if you want to for extra perks and stuff. But if you're like, I'm playing a lot right now, or I just don't have the time to delve into that, you can jump in for free, create a character, and run around for a bit. You played for free. So I'm shouting it out for anybody listening over there that if you really do want to run on the satellite, there's a free-to-play way to do it. And it's available on a lot of consoles, so and PCs as well. So the free-to-play version is very accessible. I think it's available. I've got it on PlayStation, and I've got it on my Nintendo Switch. And I've played it on the PC before. I think it's available on Xbox now. I'm not anti-Xbox. I have a Series X, but there's no reason for me to load it on the Xbox if I got it on the other things. So that's why I haven't done it. It's a game that's well worth playing free to play. So at the end of this, we're basically left with one of us as a murderer before we go to the second issue. Now, the second issue of this one, I remember this cover too. I don't know how I missed these stories because these covers I remember vividly. This was an example of I didn't get this only because of the fact that I must not have had the budget, or if I read this, Jim, and it was maybe part 2, I may have read, because these covers, I remember them. I mean, like, vividly remember them.
Right.
But when you flip the page where it says I accuse, I have no clue. I don't remember that at all. So how could I have read the issue and not have any recollection of flipping the page to that? All I can think of is that I had to make the unfortunate choice of maybe picking up Batman instead of this, or Brave and the Bold instead of this, or something. I don't know what I picked up during this era. Or, maybe it was X-Men. Would I read X-Men at this time? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what... I don't know how I would have looked at that cover and not picked it up. I didn't have the money to. I guess is the only... Because this cover I remember vividly. Like, seeing Batman there. And it's Batman's front and center going... And so you can see Power Girl's in that picture. He's pointing at somebody with a red cape. This is where I started thinking, is it... My 2 suspects are behind him. So now I'm thinking, was it Superman? This is what made me consider Superman briefly.
Well, and I'll tell you, this is something that, when I looked at that cover, I was like, it can't be Superman.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it completely, and then you flip it, and Superman's leading the charge of, I accuse, one of us is the killer and all that stuff and going through. And I'm like, and I remember when we read this, that first page, I was like, no, this, and then I went back, I looked at the cover, and I'm like, this cover just has to be a swerve.
Yep.
So I completely dismissed this cover as a swerve. So I knew 100% it wasn't Superman. So once again, I was back to thinking it could be Power Girl because, it's a swerve. And I was like, I don't know. And that's when I started really going, who is it? And that's where I kind of started losing my focus on Power Girl and going, I don't know who actually is this villain on this one. And it was kind of a neat thing for me to going into the second issue really thinking, I don't know. And that was something I was like, and I remember even just looking up this page and seeing everybody there and throwing around in my head. And for a second I thought, hey, maybe it's Dr. Fate because he talked about that dual personality thing. Maybe there's something going on with that. I still wasn't even thinking Red Tornado, and I don't know why. I probably should have been, but I'll tell you, I was not thinking Jay Garrick. That was the one person that I don't think I ever suspected, as being the actual, and I should have.
Don't you think that's where it's brilliant, though?
Yeah. Oh, God, big time.
Because
I think it's absolutely wonderful, this storytelling and how they did this. Because whenever there's these murder mysteries, and I'm reading, like, one of the things I dislike in a lot of like TV shows, with the cop TV shows and the murder mystery TV shows, I can usually figure it out very early on. Just because the regular format that some of these shows have, where they introduce the villain at a certain point in time.
Yep.
And on a lot of these shows. So I just wait for that moment, like, okay, that's the person they introduced at this time. That's your killer. I don't have any evidence, but I know the formula for these TV shows. with this comic, they completely didn't do any of the formula. And I was like, I didn't know who the villain was until the reveal. And I'm like, that was awesome.
I love that they put themselves on a lockdown that none of them can get out of.
Yeah.
Like, and Superman does it to himself too, so he recognizes even that he's a suspect. Like, it's like, I'm not putting myself as above it, because how are you going to investigate this? But they have now set a trap. They've now trapped themselves in the satellite.
Yeah, and
it's like, well, sort of, because whatever the story goes, it's super funny where this goes, and yet you get it. It's all hands on deck. Listen, we can't leave. So we have to set this up so there's absolutely no way for us to get out, so we can investigate this so the killer does not escape, and we pin this down because they killed one of our own. And so we have to determine what was really going on here. And they give you the recap of the story again. And I didn't realize growing up, how critical this was to my reading experiences, because I so often ran. You said you were reading Marvel, so Marvel at this era. Yeah. Do you remember like jumping into stories where there were like multiple parts, like 2 parts, usually 2 parts to 3 parts was the most we were getting at this era, having to figure out what was happening?
Yeah.
Or not getting the conclusion?
Yes, I remember those. And there's like, there's moments where you're just like, dang it.
Yeah. But loved it still. It was still a great experience. I take it for granted now that it's like, oh, well, I'll just find that. We're like even our talking about the death of Batman, right? We can seek out that story.
Yes,
and I'm actually gonna read it today after this, because I'm like jonesing to read it now. So I'll put in the show notes a link to what the trade paperback is and what issues they are that are the death of Batman. Just so, you want me to text them to you?
Yes, please.
So that way you can read them too. I just think it's something spinning out of this that I want to reread again, because I've read that story before, and I actually own the issues, so I know for sure it's Adventure. It was 3 issues in Adventure Comics, I think 3. I've got the issues, but I want to get. I don't have the digital version of it, which I will grab today, just because now I'm at a point where I'm getting spoiled and want to preserve my paper version by like reading the digital version, which is an interesting little issue I've developed now.
Yes, I know. I hear you, man. And I've got so many things in paper and so many things in my digital. My digital right now is my primary read. And I still have some, like, I still am getting Action Comics, still getting Detective, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. I'm still getting a bunch of titles, but I'm not reading the paper. I'm taking them, I put them in the thing, and I file them away, and this and that, and I'm not touching them. And I'm like, but I am smacking myself in the head, but I'm like, you know what? I like doing it this way. And like with certain issues like this one, I'm not going to seek out the old JSA and JLA issues. I'm going to find them digitally, and I'm going to read them digitally. Maybe I'm going to check out the DC app and all that stuff, and read them that way, and find them that way. But there's a lot of different things that I can look into, but it's we are spoiled on how easy it is for us to get this stuff. How easy it is for us to read a story if we're just reading it for reading it, and it's no longer I have to protect my collection. I have to build this collection up. I have to do this. I no longer have those issues. It's kind of neat.
So it's funny, you said something interesting about the app, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. I wasn't even thinking. So it is available on the app. So it's on the DC app. It's Adventure Comics from the 1938 series, issues 461, 462, and 463. There's a JSA story in there. It's the one that you want to follow. It's called Only Legends Live Forever. So it's a 3-parter that tells this story. So if you're looking for that, it was released in 1979.
Okay, cool.
So that's the 3-parter that you're looking for. It's available on the app if you want to read it right now. You also can buy it digitally, which I'm going to do. Because it's funny. I have the app. I will still buy it to have it, which is my own issue. I don't know. It's kind of a funny thing. It's in black and white on the app, and I know the issues are in color. So it'll get me to buy it if it's in color on Comixology, because I have the issues in color, and I can pull out the issues and read them in color, and I'm going to want to read it in color. So I'll probably go buy it on Comixology to have. But if you just want to read the story in black and white, it's available on the DC app right now. Good stuff. So you can read it for free if you're already, not really for free, you're paying for the subscription, but you can read it paying for your subscription now. I'll probably read it in both variations, just because they have the black and white art on the DC app. So I might read it that way too. Now it becomes a Batman black and white story. But that's the Death of the Batman storyline. Those are the issues that's contained in Adventure Comics 461, 462, and 463. So I won't put it in the show notes because I'm saying it here. But good stuff. So we're back to this particular story, and we see the magic user and Dr. Fate and the two Green Lanterns. And one of the Green Lanterns is magic with Alan Scott, basically trapping them inside the satellite so that way they can begin the investigation. Now they're going through at the table and talking through the facts as they know them and debating them. It gets to be a hearty debate here. The debate is kind of a crazy one because one of the people sitting at the table is, in fact, the murderer. And it's fun to look over this now knowing that Jay Garrick was the murderer. Well, not Jay, but his body was inhabited by the murderer. This sequence reads a little differently.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, you go back through knowing the truth, knowing the actual thing, the play out, because especially they're like, hey, who was the last people who spoke to him? Aside from, they're like, who's the last person who spoke to him? Well, aside from the murderer, I suppose it was us, And it's funny because that's coming from Jay. Jay is flat out saying, yeah, me and Barry were the last two to talk to him, which he knows. Now, the question I'm wondering is, with him knowing Barry Allen is the Flash, did he learn that? Did the bad guy already know that? Did the bad guy know that when he inhabited his brain? Does the bad guy now know the secret identities of everybody in the Justice League?
Well, and you don't know that. And here's what you don't know. Is that Jay having the conversation the bad guys pulled back?
Could be. That there could be time. It may not be 100% the bad guy always in charge. He could be just hidden in the background.
Right. Or he's doing a great job covering his tracks.
Right.
Because by establishing in that moment, he's established an alibi.
Exactly. Yeah, and here's the thing, because when I first read this, I was thinking the whole time, after learning, when I read it through the second time, I was thinking the whole time that the entire time it was the Spirit King running the show. But looking at it, it makes more sense that the Spirit King could hide in the background and then take control at periods of time.
The clue's great. Like when Bruce discovers it, because as they're having the debate, he discovers the fingerprints. So now the depression from a tremendous heat source.
Yeah.
It's, Bruce is like possibly that he's discovered something. It starts to give you an idea of it starts to eliminate suspects. That's where the detective work here is really cool. And he's showing it to Huntress because he knows that she will have the training to catch what he's starting to catch.
Yeah.
I really liked how he was working with her and recognizing that she was a collaborative partner. And I liked that Bruce is like, I got to talk to Barry right now. And the sequence with Barry, he's not talking to Jay, he's talking to Barry. And you start to see that Bruce is catching on to something here.
Yeah. And
I didn't catch it the first read-through. Like, Bruce was right there catching on. I don't know that I want to talk to Jay about this. What did exactly get said here? You're a police scientist and your secret identity, which makes you a better trained observer than Jay Garrick. I think there was more to that than just that piece. He didn't want to accuse Jay Garrick in that moment. I think there's another reason why he was talking to Barry alone. And I liked that there's a little subtext there.
Oh, definitely. And it was funny because I missed that, to be honest with you. When I was first reading through it, I missed the fact that, because I took it he was solely going to Barry because he was a scientist. But Bruce 100% was already suspecting Jay at this point in time. And that's why he wanted to hear exactly what was said. What exactly did Mr. Terrific say before he died? And all the conversation, and that little bit, again, where Jay said, I've dealt with the Spirit King before. And like, hey, that right there was a final kind of piece for Bruce saying, wait a minute, this guy has dealt with we're starting to see a connection here. And I think that for me was a neat moment that second and third read-through, you catch it. Initial read-through, you don't catch it. And
wait,
I also got to say, I like the fact that both, Bruce and Huntress were put on the job as the investigators.
Yep.
Not just because they're both the detectives, but it is the representative Earth 1 and Earth 2 working together. And I like how she pointed out the fact that you have two detectives. If one of us is the killer, it'll be hard to alter the evidence. And I thought that, again, was a really neat little extra stuff they put into this.
But if he tracked him down, here's what he's basically telling you in that moment. It's a member of the JSA.
Yeah.
He followed the Spirit King there.
Yes.
In that moment, it starts to eliminate suspects. So that actually eliminated Superman.
Yeah, right there, that took out Superman.
So it starts to get really fun. This sequence where Huntress gets hurt and you see Bruce's compassion. You're the daughter I could have had. I can't bear to see you suffering. And Dr. Fate healing her in those moments. That was like a cool character sequence. These are things that, like, on paper, on the surface, aren't necessary, but yet they are. It's one of the things I reference on the show Claremont's X-Men run a lot, because it was one where I felt like he did such an amazing job of being able, like, I remember the X-Men baseball games and stuff like that. I'm sure you remember that when you were a heavy X-Men reader.
Yeah.
I loved stuff like that because they were things that they did on the side that are like this, where the characters got together and they did something that was normal, that was human, that was, teamwork building, right? Well, you get to see that here in these sequences with the humanity and the human interaction. Uncle Bruce, I checked with the JSA computer, and you were right. The one we suspect also battled the Spirit King the last time he was in Gateway City. The device the Spirit King stole was from Gateway University Lab. So they figured out already at this point in time who they were going for. They know who the real person is in that. Yeah. So he and Huntress figured this out together. I loved that. And I love that she is in pain right now, but she's got to fight through it to be able to tell him, I got the info you were looking for before we were stopped. Because that was what that was all about. It was about stopping the two of them from finding out the truth. Now Bruce can reveal who the killer is. And it was really cool to see how this sequence played out, that the killer was trying to cover his tracks. First with Mr. Terrific, straight on through, the killer was trying to cover his tracks, and they had finally got it. They finally figured out who it was. And it led to the reveal that I loved this story, because when we hit the reveal, you had this great mystery leading to it, and you want to see this guy stopped at this point.
Yes.
In the worst way. So the build to this over 2 issues because an issue and a half at this point before we'd see the reveal. And I was like, I didn't see this coming. This is really cool. Now I understand how we got here and the point that they lay it out, but I did not see this coming. Now it's all hands on decks trying to chase him. I thought the brilliant part of this was the fact that it ended without a resolution. He escaped.
Yes. Well, they didn't plan for they blocked everything down, but they forgot to block the transmitter machine. And I was like, oh, guys.
Right. Well, and there was a reason not to, because they wanted to at least have some contact with the database over there, right?
Right.
So there was an actual storytelling reason as far as why, if they cut off all connection with Earth 2, they wouldn't be able to get the information they needed. So their reasoning made sense, but it gave him a way out. Here's what I don't know. Where does that story play? Does that story play out? I want to see that story.
Yeah, I was hoping there would be an editor's note or something like that. See the conclusion and blah, blah, blah. And it's not. I'm like, dang it. I got to know. I got to know how they solved this and what happened. Because there was some really cool stuff in the big reveal. Because not only was it, it was the Spirit King, but he actually did the deed. He became corporeal enough to strangle Mr. Terrific. So it wasn't actually Jay's hands that physically killed him. So that I thought was kind of neat. So when Jay eventually gets control of his body again, he won't have that guilt of being the one who actually strangled him. He will have the guilt of any help that he did with this. But he'll have that freedom from that. And again, like you, I was like, when it ended, I was like, wait, it can't end like that. We gotta know what happened.
So I paused this and did a little research because of the fact that I wanted to follow up on this because I don't know where to follow this story or where it went. So it's interesting in doing some research behind the scenes. And please forgive me, this is with a short amount of research, maybe like 15 minutes or so, while Jim and I took a brief break just to look into this. So I'm going to give you some issue numbers that I'm actually putting in the show notes. Adventure Comics 461, 462, and 463 features the death of the Earth 2 Batman that we referenced. This will be in the show notes. Adventure Comics number 466 has the follow-up funeral for Mr. Terrific from this storyline. It looks like a follow-up tale relating to what happened with the Spirit King was contained in the John Ostrander run of the Spectre, Volume 3, number 54. So I bought these issues. I haven't read them yet, so clearly, and I did page through them for the purpose of making sure that they contain the stories that we're referencing. If I'm missing something, please feel free to call in with a voicemail or send us an email letting us know, because I'll follow it up in a follow-up episode. But I want to see the ending of this story. So it looks like the actual ending, the actual confrontation with the Spirit King, takes place in that Spectre Volume 3. But from what I'm reading online, the question is that considered continuity for Earth 2 or not, and those type of pieces. But it looks like it's the story, because it actually references the events that happened in Justice League of America number 172. That's where we're at. I mean, it's kind of an interesting story that there was nowhere leaping off afterwards that had an immediate follow-up to this story. Even Justice League of America, the next issue, doesn't follow, like, with their escape from getting out of the satellite. So it's an interesting sort of chain of events that have happened here in Justice League storytelling.
Holy caffeine!
I would like to remind everyone about our show voicemail line. It's 1-440-388-4434 or Dr. Norge on Skype. We love having you part of the show. RagingBullets.com is our show website. It feeds into Twitter and our Facebook fan page. We are proud to be part of an amazing Facebook group community, and we consider this basically the message thread for this podcast. I'm always leery to say that because of the fact that the people that are running that over there are really the friends that we've made over the years who have taken it and made it their own. So we're proud to be a part of their playground. And thank you so much for everyone that posts content over there, because it really is the first place I go to find out about news and what's going on, because people have already posted links to it of all of comics and pop culture. So thank you for everyone for making that a safe and fun community, because we talk so negatively about social media a lot of the times. And I gotta be honest with you, I'm proud to be part of that group. I mean, there's some really cool people over there that make it safe and fun and are open to having really cool conversation, positive conversation around the things that we know and love. So thank you to everyone over there. I think it's a great time to talk about that. The About Us section on our show website links to us on social media and gaming platforms. It's a great way to get a hold of us. So please feel free to contact us that way. And so we love connecting with you and want to be available for that purpose. Jim, who are we sponsored by this episode?
Well, DCDS. And I'll tell you, they got the Other History of the DC Universe hardcover, 50% off, only $14.99. And we got a really cool Batman cowl statue, 25% off, only $33.71. Thank you, DCDS.
Over at InStockTrades.com, I mentioned they have a 42% off DC sale running. Go there and check it out. There's such a wide variety of books that are available that I just want to point you to that sale, because those are really cool when they have those. I usually find things that I've missed that I didn't know were available that were in collected editions. And obviously this episode's a really good one to talk about the importance of seeking out collected editions of books that you haven't read, because you've come across some really awesome stories. So thank you, DCB Service and InStockTrades.com, for continuing to support our show. Jim, 600 episodes we've been doing.
I know,
buddy.
man.
And
how awesome is that?
When we started this, if you would have said 15 years later, over 15 years later, we'd be doing 600 of these shows, and honestly loving it more. I can honestly say I'm loving this more now than I ever have, which I did not expect. I expected at a certain point I'd go, I don't know if I want to keep doing this or that type of thing. Not because I don't love comics, just figuring I might want to do something else or take a break. Or I'm feeling the exact opposite of that. I'm so energized to do this podcast now. I think we've got a really good groove going right now with the DC portion of our show being weekly or more. And then in between, doing bonus episodes every so often of these pop culture and whatnot shows where we're offering content that we normally can't put on a regular podcast. And for people that only want the DC stuff, you're getting your weekly DC dose from us. But then you have this additional like mini podcast that we run every so often that we can talk about things outside of DC Comics. I'm just having a really good time podcasting. And I want to thank you for being the go-to guy, because as I've referenced from people who maybe haven't listened in the past and you didn't know our story, when we originally were going to do this show, I thought what I wanted to do is record with a bunch of my friends who weren't comic readers at the time, give them some comic books to borrow, and talk through their experience in reading those comics. And I was going to do a rotating cast of characters. First person I went to was Jim, because as you know, if you've listened to the show for any period of time, Jim's reliable, he's kind, he's an interesting person to talk to. So you were my first go-to person. Without hesitation, you were my first thought of who I wanted to approach about doing this. And lo and behold, you were willing to do it. We recorded that first episode, and it was kind of like we knew then that we just wanted to keep doing that. So the whole premise of the show changed really after one recording, where instead of a rotating cast of characters, it became you and me doing this. And I could not imagine doing this show with anybody else. It really, Raging Bullets is the two of us recording together. And it became my show with a rotating cast of guests to being our show together. And thematically, you are the spirit of this podcast. It's I'm so thrilled that it just organically wound up being this, and that I had the brains to ask you first, because you have been nothing but dedicated and honestly put yourself through some really weird situations to get in a recording for this podcast, because your co-host is sadistic when it comes to you. But
recording from hospitals.
Yeah, that's exactly. Wait, dude, you were gonna, and I didn't realize the severity of what you were going through. I don't think you realized the severity we were going through at the time. We were talking about when you were almost paralyzed recently. The conversation we went to, and I think maybe you initiated it. I've got Izilla here. We can record from here. Next thing I know, I'm getting a text saying his surgery's done. It's like, that shows your dedication, though, to your podcast and this audience. The fact that you were in the hospital, uncertain of where things were going with you, and you wanted to record, and you wanted to, get content out just because that's what we do. So much of our lives have bled over into this podcast. I think it's one of the things I really enjoy is for you and me, our chance to hang out. And you're honestly the friend I hang out with the most because of the fact that we do this so much. It's not always, obviously we don't see each other in person as much as I would like, but my gosh, we talk and hang out all the time doing this fun stuff. And I'm glad to share that with our audience because I feel like it's you and me hanging out with them. And so I really want to thank you, as always, and I want to thank our audience for being here, whether you listen to every episode, portions of episodes, you pop in and out, however you digest us. Thank you for what's fun for me is logging on to Libsyn and seeing numbers. And what I mean by that is I don't care how we compare with other podcasts. I really am more concerned that our content is meeting the needs of our audience. I know it's kind of maybe a weird thing to say, but podcasting for me has never been a competitive venture. It's always been something that I just do for fun. I am, though, very committed to this being a professional sounding podcast, as professional as we can make it. I love this show. I've kind of considered it my baby in the sense that I've done the editing for every episode, even though my co-host has kindly offered to many times. I know that the control freak in me considers that part of this Frankenstein monster mine. You have downloaded so many episodes over the years and kept coming back for more and jumped on at various times. I really appreciate the listening audience and the fact that you've got busy days, you've got lots of podcast choices out there. If you digest us in any manner, whether it's some episodes, all episodes, portions of episodes, however you find it fitting to come and visit our episodes, thank you for doing it, because it does mean something to us to know that we have got an audience out there. Otherwise, Jim and I could just go meet and hang out and talk comics. Doing this, knowing that you're out there listening and getting something out of this means a great deal to us. So thank you so much for any amount of time that you've given us, anytime you shouted us out to other people to let them know that we might be a podcast, because we rely on that. We don't have an advertising base to let people know we're out there. You are our army. You let people know we're here and that you value something that we've done in some capacity. And I really cannot thank each of you enough. Fellow podcasters out there, we have been so lucky over the years, from the genesis of this podcast straight on through, that fellow podcasters have been a source of advice, have been a source of being a guest from time to time, have allowed us to be guests on their programs, shouted us out. So many things out there. And that's why I said before, this isn't about competition for me, because I really feel like I am lucky to be part of the comic book podcasting community at large. Really great people. Everyone I've ever met that does a comic book podcast are just awesome people. And I think my biggest regret is I try so hard to listen to every episode of my friends' podcasts out there, and I can't possibly do it because there's so much great content out there now. I have to spot check their episodes because that's the magic of comic book podcasting right now. So I just really want to, I'm not correctly articulating all the people that I should be thanking. My family's been incredibly supportive. When I started this podcast, back in its genesis, both of my parents were still alive and were incredibly supportive of this adventure. I've got a wife who from time to time is a podcast widow because of not just the recording of the podcast, but a lot of prep goes into doing this podcast. A lot of reading, rereading, keeping up on things that are currently going on at DC to choose topics for these episodes. And my wife has always been nothing but supportive of that, and I wouldn't be able to do this without her being so supportive as well. So I don't know. It's just I feel like at this time there's so many great people to thank for supporting this podcast. But Jim, like I said, it's got to start with you, and I'm so glad that I was smart enough to pick you as the first person to come on the show, because I've learned so much about you, and I think about myself too, in the sense that being open to other ideas and things have been therapeutic on this show. We've grown a lot in 15 years doing this together, and I really feel like it's the trust I have in being able to do a show like this with you, because you're that kind of guy. You're somebody I genuinely trust. You're somebody I have the highest amount of respect for. I could not have done this without you. This wouldn't have worked in their capacity. So thank you, buddy.
Hey, man, thank you, and of course also thank you, Saint Mariah, because your wife is a saint for letting you do all this stuff. Because I know the amount of hours that you put in over the amount of hours I put in is ridiculous. And that's, it's just one of those things where sometimes I feel bad because I want to do more for the show, but you are a bit of a control freak in this. I'm like, okay, Sean's not going to let me. That's cool. So I try to do what I can for the show. And that's one of the things that's, kind of part of this is, it's been one mentally and physically very therapeutic for me. Some of the worst moments of my life I've gotten through because of this show, and obviously the recent stuff, but even when this show first was happening, I had a lot of bogus stuff going on in my life, and it was this podcast that got me through it, and it was I can't let my friend down that got me through it, and it was a lot of stuff that this show has really helped me with. And we're at 600, and I'm with you, man. This is, I'm feeling wonderful about this show, and I want to keep doing it. We got 600 down, man. I'm eyeballing 1,000. I want to have episode 1,000, just because we got to do it, and there is no stopping now, and I feel, I don't know what my life would be like if I didn't have this podcast. To be honest with you, it's so affected every aspect of who I am, from the trips we've done, the people we've made, the friends we've made, and just the overall just community itself. It's amazing, and just it's funny how much of my identity is in comic books now that it wasn't when we first started. You just think about I look around my house and I've got all these statues, I've got all these comic books, I've got all this stuff that is just I never would have had. And then I think about, I look at the badges from all the different cons, and I think of all the different experiences we've done, just because of the podcast, and just looking forward to the stuff we're going to do, because of this podcast. And it's just, it's absolutely just one of those things where I can't truly articulate just how wonderful it feels and how grateful I am to be a part of this. And it's, if I can steal something from the core, in my brightest days and my blackest nights, this show has gotten me through it, and I've celebrated with you guys, and, I've cried with you guys, and it's something that, I know, and I've gotten some amazing support from people, and I really deeply appreciate the support through all the stuff, that I've gotten from everybody. And it's, something that, I don't know. I don't think I'm articulating it correctly enough, and I don't think there's any way to truly express the gratitude and just what this show really means to me, and what you as my friend mean to me. You're my brother, and it's I can't imagine anything doing even a similar show with anyone but you. It's there's just that long-time friendship that we have has gone beyond our level of friendship that we had before, and we don't get to see each other physically as enough as we normally do, but I really look forward to when we sit down and we chat and we talk. And it's funny, after we're done talking comics, you and I will talk some more, about various stuff in life that don't actually make the book, that don't actually, make the show, but it's, something that we do. And it's kind of neat to hear, what's going on with you. And, when I need, especially some of the recent stuff, I needed somebody I needed to talk to. And it was always, you I could always go to. I know I could, you helped me out with a lot of stuff, my friend. So thank you.
So the funny part is, you, first of all, as far as whether or not you articulated that well, you couldn't have articulated it better. But this is the kind of jerk I am. And I hang on your every word. There's one point in time where you slipped up and said the people we've made. So what I'm wondering right now is, are the listeners going, what do they do on these trips? Are they making Frankenstein monsters? Or what kind of things are they doing when they're traveling? And I'm not going to edit that out because I think it's funny. Right. But we'll see.
Well, there's parts when you don't see me around. So.
That's a good point. That's a very good. Jim's disappeared for a long time, to the point of the murder mystery that we had that we'd read about on this episode.
Exactly.
You are now my number one suspect. You couldn't have articulated that better. It's funny, as far as the podcast piece goes, for anybody that's put together a podcast or wonders what it's like to put together a podcast, it is a lot like putting together a puzzle. And where you become a control freak from it, and it was something that I really desired when I wanted to start a show. I had lots of conversations with Peter Rios from Comic Geek Speak at the time, and Ian Levinstein, who was doing Geek Speak at the time. Ian's now on Comic Geek Speak. They were very helpful with getting started on the podcast. Ian had me on Geek Speak, and I did multiple episodes with Ian where I was a guest, and it really got my feet wet in wanting to podcast. Comic Geek Speak allowed submissions, audio submissions, so I made some of those and just started realizing I wanted to do something more. Peter had a lot of great conversations with me because Peter's just a big DC fan. I was trying to figure out what kind of show I wanted to do. And it led to the fact that at the time there wasn't a DC-focused show. And I was looking for, do I want to do a Marvel show? Do I want a DC-focused one? Do I want to do an independence show? And Indie Spinner Rack was around at the time. And I'm like, well, okay, I don't want to go into that territory because they're already doing it. So let me try DC. And this is at the infancy of very early days of comic book podcasting. So I was trying to find something nobody was doing at the time. Now there's a plethora of a wide variety of comic podcasts out there, which is great. I think the more voices that are out there talking about comics is only good for the medium. But at the time, it was trying to fill some holes that were there in podcast choices. And when you start putting these together, it's the most daunting task of a podcast is the preparation before and the editing afterwards. But it also becomes something you take a lot of ownership of. Like anything that you've put together, you become like a mad scientist, right? I think my being a mad scientist is putting it together. Jim has kindly offered many times to edit the podcast to kind of take some of the load off. I don't know if it's the control freak part as much as for 600 episodes, I've been the mad scientist who glued this puzzle together, which is, I think, what I desired from the get-go. I wanted to put together as a creative something creative. I think I've just done this for so many episodes that it's very hard to the idea of letting go of the reins of that is really hard to do at this point. That's more, you don't have to deal with me being critical of what you're doing. I can be self-critical. Because I am. Every episode at the end, when I've finished editing it, I am the biggest critic of. I did not want to put you in that line of fire. So there really is, there's a method to my madness in that, going, how could I do that to him? Where it's like, I'm then listening back to it and critiquing what he's doing. It's not fair. So that's where it comes from. It's amazing. 600 shows. I never thought we'd be doing this. So thank you. Thank you for everyone for supporting us out there. And here's to your point, Jim. I'm aiming for 1,000 and beyond too. So we're completely in sync.
Yes.
Our next episode, we are going to be back continuing this conversation. We're going to talk about issues, Justice League of America issues 183, 184, and 185, which is a big JSA JLA crossover involving the New Gods. It's a big, big story, and it'll be fun to talk about next week. So we will see you then.
Bye.
All right, you guys. Are you ready to sing your song?
I'd say we are. Yeah, let's sing it now.
Okay, this should be fun. Now get ready for your cue. Okay, Sean?
Okay.
Okay, Jim? Jim? Jim!
Okay. Raging Bullets time is here. We talk about what we hold dear. Comic books and TV shows. Superheroes and their clothes. Justice League and so much more. I just love Green Lantern Corps. We talk about the books we've read with spoilers straight ahead.
Okay, fellas, get ready. That was very good, Sean.
Naturally.
Jim, you're a little flat there, so be careful. Jim? Jim? Jim!
Okay. Justice League and so much more. I still love Green Lantern Corps. DC Comics are what we know. The Raging Bullet Show. DC Comics are what we know. The Raging Bullet Show.
Excellent job, guys.
Let's sing it again. Yeah, let's sing it again.
No, that's enough. Let's not push it.
Push it. What is that? Yeah, what are you talking about?
No, I didn't mean anything by that.
I think
Sean,
it's right
Jim,
there. I don't know.
how long do you want the song to go?
Look, it's our production.